William Z. Foster. From Byran to Stalin. International Publishers 730489. International Publishers Company, Inc. Second printing, July 1937 GKVWWW*****. October 7th. Contents. Page. Preface. 7. Chapter. I. Beginnings. N. 2. Byran Movement. 16. 3. Socialist Party. 21. IV. Wage Workers Party. 31. V. Industrial Workers of the World. 41. V. Syndicalist League of North America 58. 7. International Trade Union Educational League. 73. 8. A. F. of L. The Meatpacking Campaign 86. X. A. F. of L. The Steel Campaign. 105. X. Red International of Labor Unions 133. XL Communist International. 143. 12. Trade Union Educational League. 164. 13. Trade Union Educational League, Conted, 185. 14. Trade Union Unity League, 216. 15. Trade Union Unity League, Conted, 245. 16. Communist Party, 282. 17. The Road Ahead, 313. Index, 346-5. Preface. In the earlier stages of its development, the world capitalist system played a historically progressive role. Based upon a more advanced method of production than feudalism which preceded it, capitalism raised cultural levels and attained a higher stage of society. It is true that these advances were made at the cost of tremendous exploitation of the working masses in all countries, yet this era of capitalism constituted a definite step forward to a richer and fuller life. But capitalism has now exhausted its progressive role. It is no longer a stimulus to social advance but a brake upon it. Caught in a hopeless contradiction between an expanding productive apparatus and shrinking markets, this social system has fallen into an acute state of degeneracy and reaction. The economic crisis, widespread and devastating, becomes chronic. Tens of millions of workers, jobless and hungry, walk the streets of industrial cities, while great factories stand idle. Millions of farmers are pauperized. Huge armies of mid-DLE class people are thrown into bankruptcy. The capitalist class, no longer able to rule these rebellious masses by petty concessions and sham democracy, has recourse to fascist demagogy and violence. In the capitalist countries, democratic liberties are being systematically abolished. Cultural reaction grows and deepens. Science is falling into decay. Invention has become largely useless for capitalist industry. The most primitive forms of religious superstition are being cultivated. Capitalist art and literature is sinking to the lowest levels in their history. And, to climax it all, the great imperialist powers, desperately struggling to capture the last market for their industries, are now swiftly preparing for a great world slaughter beside which all previous wars will seem like minor conflicts. This is a picture of a system of society in decay, a process 7. Which Marx and Engels so long ago foresaw. Capitalism has outlived its usefulness. Its economic crises, mass starvation, fascist terrorism, cultural reaction and wars are only so many symptoms of a desperate effort to maintain itself in the face of historical circumstances that demand its abolition. The capitalist class will not willingly give up its wholesale robbery, even though its frantic attempts to prolong the rule of capitalism threaten the lives and welfare of hundreds of millions of human beings. The great lesson of all this, pointed to by a million facts of present-day life, is that capitalism must be abolished. This is a historically necessary task. The huge masses of exploited workers, farmers and lower middle class, in a vast united front, stimulated and led by the Communist Party, must overthrow this monstrous system, organize a Soviet government, take over the great factories, the land and other means of production, and abolish human exploitation by setting up a productive system for use instead of for profit. That is, they must establish socialism, which is the first phase of communism. Only in this way can economic crises, unemployment and war be abolished and the human race put upon an upward path leading to prosperity, freedom, culture and peace. The living evidence of the correctness of this revolutionary solution is to be found in the Soviet Union. Here we see a huge nation of 170 million people, in a country 3 times as large as the United States, engaged in building socialism. While the whole capitalist world suffers from industrial decay and social degeneration, the U.S.S.R. strides ahead on every front. Unparalleled industrial and agricultural expansion, swiftly rising living standards, a new and growing democratic liberty, a mighty cultural advance, etc. The Soviet Union is the beginning of the new world society of socialism. It is a trailblazer for the exploited millions of the whole earth. The writer has for many years been convinced that only along this revolutionary way can the workers and other Exploited masses free themselves from slavery, only thus can society find the road to progress. In this book, I have tried to show those forces which impelled me, an American worker, to arrive at these revolutionary conclusions, to become a communist. Two general phases are covered in this book. The earlier chapters deal with my experiences in industry and the labor movement and lead up to my adoption of the principles of Marxism-Leninism, and the later chapters deal with the period after my affiliation to the Communist Party, that is, with the question of applying these principles in the United States. I have paid special attention to the matter of revolutionary trade unionism, to which I have devoted most of my work in the class struggle. Chapter I. Beginnings. My father, James Foster, was Baum in County Carlow, Ireland, of peasant stock. He was a Fenian and an ardent fighter for Irish independence. Among his nationalist activities, he was delegated to enlist in the British Army to agitate among the many Irish soldiers it contained. While at this work, he helped organize a projected revolt in which the Irish soldiers were to suddenly seize Ireland, the regular British garrison being seriously weakened at the time by troop removals to India. But this rather desperate scheme was betrayed by a traitor. Consequently, my father, as well as many others, had to flee instantly. A political immigrant, he arrived in the United States in 1868, settling in the Boston district. He never returned to Ireland, although at the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, he, with many others, received amnesty. In this country, my father, until his death in 1901, was a worker, being by occupation a carriage washer or livery stableman. For a short while, without giving up his regular work, he tried unsuccessfully to establish a small store. Although he became a citizen and, like most other Catholics, supported the Democratic Party, he took but little part in American politics. His main interest was in independence for Ireland, and during my boyhood my political meat and drink at home was militant Irish nationalism. In 1887, we moved from Boston to Philadelphia, where I lived until 1900, and during this time our home was a center for Irish patriots, many of whom were Molly Maguires who had fled from the persecutions of the coal barons in the Pennsylvania anthracite regions. 11. My father was very active and powerful physically. He claimed that in his youth he was champion of Great Britain in 3 sport events: the broad jump, high jump, and hop, skip and jump. He was a rough and tumble scrapper of local renown, and his special predilection was to fight Irish policemen. Being an ardent sportsman, he made our home a rallying point for ballplayers, runners, boxers, racetrack men, cockfighters, dogfighters, etc. He was 60 years old when he died. My mother, Elizabeth McLaughlin, was born in Carlisle, England. She came of English and Scotch ancestry. For generations her family had been textile workers and she was a weaver by trade. She used to tell, from first-hand knowledge, about the terrible starvation conditions that the English textile workers, including her parents, had lived through during the period, so graphically described by Marx and Engels, when the old hand loom was being displaced by the new power loom in the British textile industry. She was a devout Catholic, my father being somewhat negligent religiously, although a professed Catholic. Despite her slender build, my mother was, like my father, of excellent physique, and she bore him no less than 23 children. Most of these children, chiefly because of our poverty, died in infancy, only 3 besides myself, Anna, Mabel, Clara, being now alive. They live on the West Coast. My mother lived a life of hardship and drudgery, made worse by her excessive childbearing. Her political activities were nil, although she was quite intelligent. Like my father, Ex-Vo told us many times that he had gone to school only one day and that day school did not keep. My mother had little or no formal education. Her life was one long struggle against the sea of poverty in which we nearly always lived. She died in 1901 at the age of 53. I was born in Taunton, Massachusetts, near Boston. Utivisuda TNTFI. Rayo, Yushin WA8 first raised in the Untefel States. 6. H was a red Florida and was hooted upon the town green, or public square. Hezekiah Butterworth says in the opening verse, less than HP, N. TH, K, flag, N greater than. February 25, 1881. When I was 6 years old our family moved to Philadelphia, where for the most part, because of my father's small wages and big family, we lived in slum and semi-slum neighborhoods. From the age of 7 to 10 I went to school, selling newspapers the while. But at 10, so meager was the family income, I had to quit school and go to work. My first job, in 1891, was with a sculptor, Kretschmann by name. He was an artist of many accomplishments, among which were painting, modeling, stone cutting, wood carving, die sinking, electroplating, etc. He had helped in the construction of the giant statue of William Penn now atop the Philadelphia City Hall. My job with Kretschmann was the first of my 26 years' experience as a worker, an experience which took me into many industries, including chemical, lumber, metal, meatpacking, agriculture, marine transport, railroads, building construction, etc., all over the country from New York to California, and from Florida to Washington. This eventually gave me a broad first-hand knowledge of the worker's life and its hardships. I stayed 3 years with Kretschmann, but the wages he paid were so low, from $1.50 per week for the first year to $2 for the third, that I quit him. The hard times of the middle 90s were upon us and, with my father and eldest brother out of work, we had to eke out our living by frequent visits to the neighborhood soup kitchen. I had to make more wages somehow. Men could find no work, but there were always places for child slaves, so I got a job at $3 per week at the local type foundry of McKellar, Smith & Jordan, where I worked some 3.5 years and learned much of the type founder's trade. The grand years have numbered 110, since the first flag of freedom ascended the sky, and the fair green of Taunton made heroes of men. As men saw the ensign unfolding on high, the motto of union and liberty rolled out into the suntides of vermilion and gold, and loud cried those heroes of liberty bold, "We'll defend it with valor and virtue and votes." The red flag of Taunton that waves o'er the green. Stirrings of class consciousness. In these years as a boy worker, denied the opportunity for an education and living in a poverty-stricken home, I early felt the iron of the class struggle sink into my heart. I, of course, had no inkling of what was wrong and who was my real enemy, beyond a vague feeling that the rich were somehow at the bottom of it all. But I deeply resented the poverty in which I had to live, for even my boyish eyes could see that there were many well-off people who apparently did no work, yet lived in luxury. Meanwhile, my father was exerting all efforts to make an ardent Irish nationalist of me, which my mother aided by doing whatever she could to develop me into a devout Catholic. And both my parents had some success. I took Catholicism earnestly, and my first serious political reaction was a burning desire to help free Ireland, to which, in my boyish enthusiasm, I determined to devote my whole life when I grew up. This decision was all the more strengthened as I plunged into reading history, and I drew inspiration from the American and French revolutions. Especially was I fascinated by the French Revolution, and I had read a half-dozen histories of it by the time I was 13 years old. I burned with the desire to participate in a great struggle like that, to deal real blows against the oppressor, and the way I saw to do it was by helping free Ireland from the age-long yoke of England. My first strike. But my father's plan to make a militant Irish nationalist of me eventually failed. The exigencies of my life as a worker decided another fate for me. Suffering under the lash of poverty and exploitation myself, and seeing all about me many manifestations of the workers' determination to resist similar conditions, I was instinctively drawn into the American class struggle. I felt rather than knew that I did not have to look to England for the real enemy but must meet him in the United States. So I began to follow with great interest and sympathy the many strikes and other struggles of the workers in this period. The first strike in which I actually participated was that of the Philadelphia Street Carmen in 1895, when I was 14 years old. The strike lasted only about a week, but it was very bitterly fought. The men tied up the whole trolley system in a struggle to defeat a wage cut. The company replied by trying to break the strike with professional strikebreakers and police violence. I, together with other strikers and sympathizing workers, was clubbed and ridden down by mounted police at 15th and Market Streets in a vicious charge of these thugs against a peaceful parade of strikers. The workers replied to such tactics by the firmest solidarity and extreme militancy. They were supported by the broad ranks of the workers, whose hatred of the old horse car companies had not weakened towards the then brand new electric lines. Riots broke out all over the city. I remember how the proletarian youths in our neighborhood around 17th and South Streets, for several days running, wrecked every car that ventured through that territory. The strike, I believe, was finally settled by some sort of a compromise. It was my baptism in the class struggle, and it exerted a profound influence upon my general outlook. By now, I had become a trade unionist, in theory at least, for I had no opportunity to belong to an organization. I had learned the elementary lesson that the individual worker is helpless against the employer, and that only by combining his forces with other workers can he exercise any influence in the vital matter of his wages. From then on I followed the trade union manifestations of the class struggle with an increasing ardor, and my interest in Ireland began to sink into a secondary position. My attention was now definitely centered upon the American class struggle. Chapter E. The Byran Movement. The decade when I was a growing lad, from the middle 80s to the middle 90s, was one of active struggle by the workers. In point of militancy, it was unequaled for the next 25 years. This was the heyday of the Knights of Labor and the foundation period of TLIE, American Federation of Labor. Some of the greatest strikes in the history of the United States took place during this time. It was an era of rapidly intensifying capitalist exploitation. Its brutal spirit was typified by "the public be damned" Vanderbilt. The capitalists were increasingly robbing both workers and farmers, and their new trusts were already crushing the small businessmen. Wholesale raids were being made by the railroads upon the great tracts of government-owned fanning, timber and mineral lands. The state and national government reeked with open corruption and shamelessly did the capitalists' bidding. Efforts of the workers to organize and to strike against their hard conditions were repressed ruthlessly by the widespread use of the blacklist, troops, Pinkerton gunmen and professional scabs. The workers did not tamely submit, however, but fought militantly for their living standards, as many bitter struggles testify. Their fighting spirit, animated by a strong class instinct rather than class consciousness, grew out of their resistance to the increasing pressure from a swiftly expanding capitalism. Not a small factor in developing their great struggle was the fact that the later conservative labor aristocracy of skilled workers had not fully developed, and, besides, the union leadership had not yet fallen completely under the sway of the capitalists. Misleaders of labor there were aplenty in this period, such as the notorious Powderly, head of the K. of L. Arthur, reactionary Grand Chief of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, and the infamous Gompers bureaucracy was already entrenching itself. But such traitorous elements were as yet unable to exert the deadening influence on the trade unions that they did in later years. Many of the trade union top leaders, of the Martin Irons type, were honest fighters, and they gave militant leadership to the masses. Besides, the revolutionary elements, chiefly Socialist Labor Party and anarchist groupings, working within the existing unions, exerted much influence in stimulating the masses to struggle. This decade of extreme working-class militancy was started off by the Great 8-Hour Strike movement of 1886 centering in Chicago, which greatly stimulated the trade unions everywhere, and which resulted in the legal lynching of its anarcho-syndicalist leaders Parsons, Spies, Fisher, Engel and Ling. Soon this historic struggle was followed by another almost equally famous, the Homestead Strike of 1892, when the steelworkers, fighting a losing battle against the growing steel trust, drove away the Pinkerton thugs in armed struggle and seized the local steel mills, rifles in hand. Then, in May 1894, in the midst of the great industrial crisis of that time, developed the powerful strike of the American Railway Union led by Eugene V. Debs, which was crushed by a combination of violence by the federal government and treachery by A. F. of L. and railroad craft union officials. Meanwhile, in the Rocky Mountain states, among the metal miners, the Western Federation of Miners, with William D. Haywood as its leading spirit, was developing a whole series of the most spectacular and hard-fought strikes in American labor history, many of them being armed conflicts of the workers against company thugs and state troops. And another famous movement of this period was Coxey's National March of the Unemployed upon Washington, a movement that profoundly stirred the working class, stricken as it was by the huge wage cuts and unemployment caused by the prevailing economic crisis. The Bryan Free Silver Campaign. While the workers were thus resisting American capitalism so militantly, the small farmers of the Middle West were also in a high state of political discontent. They were suffering many hardships. Their erstwhile free homestead lands all become loaded with mortgages, tenancy was rapidly on the increase among them, and they were heavily burdened with taxes and increasingly falling under the pressure of the railroads and various trusts which preyed upon them. To make their conditions unendurable came the great economic crisis of Tire 90s, which knocked the bottom out of agricultural prices. There was also much discontent among the urban petty bourgeoisie, or small manufacturers, merchants, etc. They were feeling the crushing power of the growing trusts and monopolies. Already they had succeeded in having the Sherman Anti-Trust Law passed in 1890 in a vain attempt to stifle the growth of monopoly. Their cup of unrest was also filled to overflowing by the deep industrial crisis of this period. It was upon this general background of discontent of the workers, farmers and city middle class that the Bryan Democratic Party campaign of 1896 developed. It originated in the Populist Party of the Farmers, and the farmers remained the backbone of the movement, although large numbers of workers and city middle-class elements also participated in it. The program of the Bryan movement showed that it was basically of a petty bourgeois character, a fruitless attempt to stem the swift advance of the trusts and finance capital and to maintain the traditional competitive system and civil liberties. Its central plank, the free coinage of silver at the rate of 16 ounces of silver to 1 of gold, was an inflationary scheme of the farmers to rid themselves of their increasing debts by creating cheap money, an illusion that still prevails among them. Other planks of Bryan called for government ownership of the railroads and telegraphs, abolition of the national banks, tariff for revenue only, graduated income tax, postal savings bank, government loans on real estate, popular election of U.S. senators, initiative and referendum, Australian ballot system, 1 term for the president, 8 hours for government employees, abolition of detective agencies, restriction of immigration, abolition of injunctions in labor disputes. But the center of the whole movement was free silver, the rest of the program being largely ignored in the election agitation. Although many of Bryan's proposals were of importance to labor, the mass of the workers did not rally to them. True, the A.F. of L gave Bryan a roundabout endorsement and Debs, already widely known from the A.R.U. strike, supported him openly. But the great bulk of workers, who had no organized mass party and who for the most part felt their grievances to be economic rather than political, were caught by the McKinley big capitalist slogans of sound money, high tariffs, high wages and the full dinner pail. Bryan was overwhelmingly defeated by the combined big capitalist forces of the industrial East and the Middle West, who boldly announced they would close their factories if Bryan were elected. Thus the door was flung still wider open for the retreat of the middle class and the advance of triumphant monopoly capital. My first political activities. I was profoundly stirred by all these great events. Especially was I interested and aroused by the bitter strikes of the period. It is true that I knew of 1886 only from the older workers, but it was then still a strong tradition among them and I eagerly absorbed it. The A.R.U. strike of 1894 I remember quite distinctly, and I read with close attention the newspaper reports of the fierce strikes of the Rocky Mountain metal miners and also of the many struggles of the coal miners in the neighboring anthracite districts of Pennsylvania. My sense of solidarity with the workers was actively aroused. I followed with bated breath the march of Coxey's army, and on my way to work I used to linger around Coxey's recruiting office at 13th and Filbert Streets to read the displayed bulletins from all over the country as to the progress of the various detachments of the army. When the movement came to its absurd anticlimax, by Coxey's being arrested for walking on the Capitol lawn, it was for me a personal tragedy. But the greatest effect of all upon my AWOC-ending class feeling was produced by the great Homestead strike of steel workers. I was only 11 years old at the time, but I remember how I shared my father's indignation at the sending of the Philadelphia National Guard regiments to Pittsburgh and his protests at the news that a National Guard soldier, Henry Lambs by name, had been hanged by the thumbs for several hours by his officers because he had called for 3 cheers for the man, the anarchist, Alexander Burke man, who had just shot Frick, head of the Carnegie Steel Company. The numerous strikes were rapidly developing my proletarian class instinct. I was all for the workers in their fight and I wanted to participate in the struggle. My earlier dreams of one day actively helping to free Ireland sank further and further into the background. I was only 15 years old when the Bryan campaign of 1896 came. But I went for it enthusiastically. Of course, I was quite unable to judge of the middle-class political content of Bryan's platform, but it looked to me like a real fight against the great trusts that were oppressing workers and farmers in common, so I gave the movement such support as a lad of 15 years might. I attended political meetings. I went to hear Bryan speak. I saturated myself with the campaign arguments pro and con. I marched in the torchlight processions. And when Bryan was defeated it came as a heavy blow to me. I got my first D degree. P degree W were possessed by the ruling X-R versus I of ing ill altogether. This campaign had for me a big educational effect. Chapter 3. The Socialist Party. Forces were at work which were rapidly developing my native proletarian instinct into genuine class consciousness. I was fast outgrowing the petty bourgeois limits of the Bryan movement and was on the way to a revolutionary outlook. For one thing, my experience in industry was broadening. By the end of 1900 I had added to my previous jobs 3 years' work in the fertilizer industry, working in plants in Reading, Pennsylvania, and Jacksonville, Florida, where I had become a steam fitter, stationary engineer and an expert fertilizer mixer. I had also worked in Florida peonage lumber camps, put in 2 months as a brakeman on the P&R Railroad and spent 6 months as a trolley car motorman on the 3rd Avenue line in New York City. It was at the latter occupation that I joined my first union, the street carmen. Conditions were abominable on the New York cars, the men being completely unorganized and the company arbitrarily dictating wage and working conditions. I decided to try to change all this. I went to see Herman Robinson, A.F. of L. organizer. Then I had my first experience with an A.F. of L. bureaucrat. Robinson refused to help us, and was even reluctant to take our little group's applications to join the union. We got so far, however, as to set up secretly union groups in several car barns, but the movement was exposed by a spy and the leaders, including myself, were summarily discharged. The incipient union was thus destroyed. From personal experience and my reading I had had it knocked into me that in their greed for profits the employers rob the workers ruthlessly and are quite indifferent to their sufferings or that of their families. All of which greatly stimulated my fighting spirit and determination to resist such. That had been so assiduously drilled into me at school, in church, through the newspapers and in the factories. Thus my schoolboy conception of the government got many disastrous shocks. The sending of the National Guard to Homestead, the use of troops in the A.R.U. strike, the embalmed beef outrage in the Spanish-American War, which, among others, almost killed my brother John, a soldier of the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment, Mark Hanna's brutal attack upon the workers in the 1896 elections, the vicious use of troops and police everywhere against striking workers, etc., were smashing my youthful notions of the impartial role of the government. I distinctly felt, even though I did not know just how, that the government was in the hands of the bosses and was an enemy of the workers. At the same time, I was also rapidly losing faith in the religion which my Catholic mother had so carefully taught me. This was partly because of my hard practical experience as a worker, but mainly through omnivorous reading in my favorite fields of history and science. The first anti-religious book I read was Tom Paine's Age of Reason. This shattered my faith entire Bible. Next I read Lecky's History of European Morals and Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, books which destroyed my belief in the holiness of the papacy and the Mother Church. Then, late in the 90s, in my incessant reading I came to Darwin's Origin of Species and Descent of Man. These books, which I read with amazement, introduced me to the theory of man's evolution from lower animals and definitely ended my belief in human immortality. After Darwin I read Spencer's Data of Sociology, with its theories of the origin and evolution of God, the devil and religion in general. All this made me a conscious atheist. It only required my later years' reading of Marx and Lenin to teach me the RDLE of religion as a weapon of the exploiting classes and to give me the theoretical foundation for a materialist scientific outlook on life and death. I become a socialist. This whole process of disillusionment with capitalist economics, government and religion was preparing me for my transformation into a socialist, which came with dramatic suddenness. One night, in the summer of 1900, I was walking along at Broad and South Streets and, noticing a street speaker, I stopped to listen. He was a socialist, evidently of the Socialist Labor Party, but his name I never learned. It was my first actual contact with the revolutionary movement. Previously my knowledge of socialism and anarchism had been derived from vague, distorted and misleading articles in the capitalist press and from similar sources. I had never even encountered a socialist book or pamphlet, despite my wide reading. I listened entranced by what the speaker said. I remember he sharply assailed Bryanism, but I found myself in complete agreement with him. His arguments and analysis seemed to give real meaning to all my experience in the class struggle. His proposals for the workers to take over the government and the industries and to abolish the profit system appealed to me as the only real solution of the workers' problem, and my 35 years of later experience in life have only confirmed this first opinion. The speaker was a good one and I drank in his words eagerly. I left the meeting in great enthusiasm, later eagerly reading a couple of pamphlets I had bought at the time. Although with as yet only an inkling of the great world outlook comprised under the term socialism, I began to count myself, from that time on, a socialist. That street meeting indeed marked a great turning point in my life. Now I began to read socialist literature in earnest and to become more acquainted with the movement. In the fall of 1900 I was working in a fertilizer plant at Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, near Reading, when the elections came on. Debs and Harriman were the socialist candidates. Although only 19 years old and too young to vote myself, I walked 6 miles with another worker, my brother-in-law, George McVeigh, to help him cast his vote for the socialist ticket. The following year I joined RHE Socialist Party, then just being formed out of the split-off from the Socialist Labor Party. An interlude. From 1901 to 1904 my revolutionary development suffered a rude interruption. The 2.5 years I had worked with lead in the type foundry as a child worker had undermined my health. The 3 years following in the fertilizer industry, where we usually toiled totally unprotected, in dense clouds of poisonous dusts, so broke me down further that the doctors pronounced me a consumptive. One was in a fair way to go to an untimely grave, grinding out profits for employers, as vast armies of workers had done before me. It so happened, however, that I was without family responsibility. My parents were both dead and my 2 elder sisters were married. So I quit my job, pulled up stakes and headed for the West. With $20 in my pocket I took a steamer to Galveston, Texas. There I quickly went broke. I managed, however, to earn a small road stake at a nearby railroad construction camp, where I developed into the second cook, and then I hoboed my way on the Southern Pacific the 3,000 or more miles to Portland, Oregon, via Los Angeles. This trip was a harrowing experience, what with hunger, sleeplessness, dodging city police and railroad bulls, and the hardships of train riding. I had several narrow escapes and learned at first hand the dangers and difficulties of the worker beating his way over the railroads. In the next dozen years, in the course of my work as a revolutionary agitator, I made 6 more such coast-to-coast hobo trips, as well as a couple from Chicago to the Pacific coast. All these trips I made in the winter, except one. Several times I was arrested, twice I nearly froze to death, and on dozens of occasions I barely missed being ground beneath the wheels. I acquired thoroughly the hobo's knack of beating the road, learning to ride everything, passengers and freights, inside and outside, trucks, tops, rods, blinds, bumpers, etc. Everywhere except, as the saying went, in the hog heads, engineers, whiskers. These trips gave me a wide knoll edge of the army of floating unemployed workers, as well as of the criminal elements drifting over the railroads. They were instructive experiences. Arrived in Oregon on my first trip, I worked for a few months on the local docks and in neighboring logging camps and railroad construction jobs. Then, one fine day early in the winter of 1901, I shipped out of Portland on an old square-rigged sailing vessel. She was the Pegasus, a British four-masted bark, and bound around Cape Horn for Cape Town, South Africa, with a cargo of wheat. Thus opened my period as a deep-water sailor, my most interesting and unforgettable experience as a worker. During this time I sailed 1.5 times around the world. Twice I doubled Cape Horn and once the Cape of Good Hope. I served, before the mast, in 4 typical hungry British merchant, lime juicer, square riggers, the Pegasus, Black Prince, Alliance and County of Cardigan, and became a full-fledged able seaman. All told, the voyage, counting considerable stays on the South African, Australian and South American coasts, lasted almost 3 years and covered some 50,000 miles. It gave me a real taste of hunger, hardship, low wages and danger, and it exposed me to the rawest and most callous exploitation. It helped very much to steel me in my growing revolutionary convictions. My last ship, the County of Cardigan, paid off at North Shields, England, and I took steamer for Philadelphia. There, I joined the Atlantic Coast Seamen's Union, intending to work as a sailor on the coast. But again I listened to the siren song of the West, where one of my sisters had gone. So once more, I hoboed my way across the country, this time directly from New York to Portland, for, of course, my 3 years at sea had yielded me practically no money with which to pay my fare. I arrived in Oregon early in November 1904, just in time to vote for Debs for president. In this knocking about for 3 years my health had greatly improved. Apparently my tuberculosis was cured or checked, and I was interested when, 30 years later, doctors in a Moscow hospital informed me that their X-ray examination showed old tuberculosis lesions in my lungs had healed over. I became a party worker. From 1904 to 1907 I worked in the Portland area and began to take an active part in the Socialist Party. I paid up my dues in the local branch and began to read the party literature. I read the pamphlets of Wayland, Work, Richard Son, etc., and then branched out to read substantial material, such as the Communist Manifesto, Wage Labor and Capital, Value, Price and Profit, and other works of Marx and Engels. I also eagerly devoured the first volume of Capital, which appeared in America about that time. I read nearly all of de Leon's pamphlets and books and many of those of Lafargue, Plekhanov, Kautsky, Bebel, etc. But of Lenin I never heard a word or saw a line. My activities centered in the Portland branch, then dominated by one Tom Sladden. I avidly participated in the many discussions and activities of the local. I was an ardent supporter of the appeal to reason, a member of its famous Army. My growing revolutionary knowledge and enthusiasm was greatly stimulated by the fragmentary reports we received of the Russian Revolution of 1905. The formation of the I.W.W. In 1905 I looked upon with great interest, but I failed to join it as I did not agree with the anti-parliamentary tendencies it was already manifesting. The arrest and kidnapping of Moyer, Haywood and Pettibone in 1906 shook the labor movement and stimulated great defense activity among us socialists. Their acquittal in 1907, directly forced by the mass pressure of the metal miners and masses of other aroused workers, we hailed as a tremendous victory. By this time I considered myself a full-fledged socialist, but to learn. During these 3 years I worked in many local industries characteristic of the Pacific Northwest: farming, logging, sawmills, building, metal mining, railroad construction, railroad train service, etc. I became a pretty typical Western floating worker. At this time the tail end of the great generations-long national homestead movement was still on, there still being free government land of poor quality in the western states, and many workers were taking up claims either to become real farmers or to make easy money. So my brother-in-law and I took up a homestead and timber claim apiece, 320 acres for each. Our claims were in Oregon, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. It was a wild country, heavily timbered and full of fish and game, back of the famous Hood River Apple District and some 15 miles from the railroad. We built ourselves log cabins and for 3 years spent 2 or 3 months each summer on the place grubbing land and becoming acquainted with the highly interesting backwoods life. The remaining 9 or 10 months per year we put in as workers in various Oregon industries. Finally, we proved up on our places and I then sold mine for a few $100s. In later years this homestead district, unfit for farming, was deserted by the homesteaders and it reverted back to the wilds. It was the first and last time I ever owned property of any kind. I have never seen the place since. Meanwhile I had secured a job as fireman on the O.R. and N on the Portland Umatilla Division. This was tough work, what with 2 heavy trains, engines in bad repair and the miserable real estate, as we called the inferior coal we had to burn. Although the firemen were selected for strength, every man on our division had at one time or another been taken from his engine en route, too exhausted to proceed further. After 6 months of this grueling work I made a application to join the B of L, F, and E, having decided to work up to an engineer. But then came the sharp industrial crisis of 1907, which swept me out of work and wrecked my P. The crisis broke with dramatic suddenness. A week before it hit, every industry was booming, workers were in great demand and wages were at record levels. But 2 weeks later the bottom had fallen out of everything, industry simply folded up and armies of unemployed appeared as if by magic. All banks closed at once, and to keep them shut the governor, for a month, declared each succeeding day a legal holy day. No money was to be had, all cash transactions being carried on by means of wheat checks issued by the 101th Land Chamber of Commerce. Similar conditions prevailed in the other western states. It was an economic hurricane, a graphic example of the insanity of the capitalist system of production and distribution. The internal fight in the Socialist Party. During these several years my revolutionary understanding and enthusiasm were rising. I was a very ardent supporter of the Socialist Party, which was torn by a bitter and grooving internal struggle in the Pacific Coast states. In order to understand this fight it is necessary to give something of its background. The decade in question was one of growing working-class organization and class consciousness under the fierce pressure of expanding American capitalism. It was a period of many bitter strikes, of which the bloody 1905 Chicago Teamsters strike, in which 21 were killed and 415 wounded, was an example. Since 1898, the A.F. of L had increased its membership from 270,000 to 1,550,000. The movement for a more effective type of unionism, industrial instead of craft, was also developing and it finally resulted in the formation of the I.W.W. in 1905, with great acclaim on the part of revolutionary and progressive forces in the labor movement. The Socialist Party also reflected this rising tide of working-class organization and struggle. Its membership ran up from a few thousands in 1901 to about 42,000 in 1909, and its vote increased accordingly. Its main proletarian strength came from the foreign-born workers, but it also had a thick sprinkling of American skilled workers, many of whom occupied official positions in the trade unions. Some of the strongest sections of the S.P. were in such agricultural states as Oklahoma, Texas, California, Oregon, Washington and Nebraska, former populist strongholds, where the more radical populist remnants, betrayed by Byran, joined the S.P. attracted by its program of government ownership and other immediate demands, which many of them conceived as populism under a new veneer of socialist phraseology. The Socialist Party also attracted many radical elements of the city petty bourgeoisie who were feeling acutely the pressure of the trusts upon the middle class and who had no faith in the two old parties. Hence, the party became infested with a horde of lawyers, doctors, priests, preachers, etc., and many small manufacturers and businessmen, with an occasional millionaire socialist thrown in. Such were the Hillquids, Burgers, Works, Wallings, Spargos, Russells, Myers, Whalens, Simons, Harrimans, Bensons, Stokes, etc. Ultra-vocal and very energetic, these non-proletarian intellectuals had seized leadership of the S.P. and controlled its policy, and their like do so until the present day. Domination of the S.P. by these middle-class intellectuals condemned the party to a policy of opportunism. Their conception of the party's role was to serve as an instrument of the petty bourgeoisie against the advancing big capitalists, which meant a near Byran movement under a new guise. They attempted to subordinate the working class and to supplying the fighting troops of the middle class. Their maximum program was a thin gruel of government-owned industries duly bought from the capitalists and called socialism. Their solid party control was vigorously used against every effort of the proletarian members to give the S.P. a revolutionary program and to make it the real leader of the workers in the class struggle. The S. Tenary Gomper's trade union bureaucrats, they sabotaged the struggle for industrial unionism, they suppressed every effort to carry on revolutionary agitation among the masses, they systematically cultivated illusions of a gradual and peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism. The revolutionary worker members of the party deeply resented this petty bourgeois intellectual control and opportunist regime. Especially acute was the discontent in the West, where many factors had combined to make the workers' long the most revolutionary in the United States, this section being the home of the Fighting Western Federation of Miners and I.W.W., and also of the most advanced sections of the S.P. and A.F. of L. Many of the militant workers got disgusted with the S.P. Opportunism, quit the party and drifted into the syndicalistic I.W.W. Others stuck in the S.P. and began an organized struggle against the reformist leadership. This was the fight, an inter-party phase of the general class struggle, that was developing in the years I spent in the Portland local, 1904 to 1907. Not unnaturally, I took an active interest in this factional struggle and at once found myself in the left wing of the party. All my experience and reading in the class struggle had tended to make a militant of me. I had learned the elementary lesson that the class struggle is indeed a fight. I was profoundly convinced that the reformist plan of gradually turning capitalism into socialism by a series of reforms was futile, that the ruthless capitalist class could never be talked, voted or bought out of power, but would yield only to the superior force of the toiling masses. So I joined definitely with die-proletarian elements that wanted to make of the Socialist Party a revolutionary organization. Chapter IV. The Wage Workers' Party. The internal fight in the Socialist Party eventually developed throughout the country, and reached a head in the struggle led by William D. Haywood and the Marcy Kerr International Socialist Review Group in 1912. But in the years I am dealing with, its most advanced phases were to be found on the Pacific Coast, and its main center there was in Seattle, Washington. The leader of the opposition, Drive, Herman F. Titus, was editor of the local paper, the Seattle Socialist. Titus was a brilliant speaker, a forceful writer, an energetic agitator and one of the outstanding Marxians then in the United States. His greatest weaknesses were an incurable leftism and a strong tendency to bureaucratic arbitrariness. The Titus Group had many forces and connections throughout Washington and in parts of California, Oregon, Idaho and Montana. It so happened that the industrial crisis of 1907 uprooted me in Portland and, job-seeking, I had made my way to Seattle. Here I worked mostly as a building laborer and in the local sawmills during 1907-9. I at once became affiliated to the Titus Opposition Group and also took an active part in the work of my A.F. of L local union, the Building Laborers. The split of 1909. When I arrived in Seattle the S.P. internal fight was already acute. The state organization was in the hands of typical opportunist intellectuals, led by a slick dentist, Drive E. J. Brown, who in later years became mayor of Seattle on a fusion ticket. The majority of the party membership favored the left opposition. The fight, centering around the main question of proletarian versus petty bourgeois control of the party, developed into a struggle for power with many ramifications. The Light Wing, with the full support of the National Executive Committee of the Socialist Party, tried to suppress every revolutionary tendency in the party. They attempted to turn the party into a sort of local public ownership league and petty reform movement. Everything was sacrificed for vote catching. The left wing, on the other hand, tried to make the party a fighting organization. It circulated Marxian pamphlets, making wide use of the newly appeared Road to Power by Kautsky. It supported the general line of the International Socialist Review Group, gave cooperation only to left-wing speakers and tried to extend real aid to the struggles of the I.W.W. and other militant unions. The party fight grew hotter and hotter. The factions began to expel each other's members from the various branches. The situation climaxed in the party state convention held in Everett early in 190 grams. Both sides made the most strenuous efforts to elect delegates. The left wing was supported mostly by lumber workers, city laborers and semi-proletarian, stump, farmers. The rights had the backing of the petty businessmen, intellectuals, skilled workers and better-off farmers. Doubtless the left wing actually polled the majority of votes, but when the convention assembled the right wing had managed to collect a substantial majority of the delegates. The left wing at once made the charge, with justice, that the rights had utilized their control of the party machinery to pack the convention. Good tactics, however, would have required that the lefts temporarily submit to this manufactured majority and then use the situation to organize the struggle further locally and nationally. But the impulsive, leftist, Titus was too hasty for that. Under his leadership the left wing refused to participate in the convention, withdrew its delegates, held its own convention and elected a state secretary. There were thus two socialist parties in Washington. The National Executive Committee of the Socialist Party went into action. Without further ado, it pronounced the left-wing convention illegal, recognized the right-wing state secretary and gave the left-wingers the option of rejoining the party as individuals, provided they could pass muster under the sharp scrutiny of the victorious Drive Brown and his allies. In general, the left-wingers refused to accept these harsh terms. Few ever went back to the Socialist Party. The result was that organization crashed on the rocks in Washington and lost the greater part of its strength. Expelled from the party, what were we next to do? At first we tried to keep going our version of the Socialist Party. But this policy could not continue, because there was a great disinclination to use the hated name of the Socialist Party. We had, therefore, to cast about for a new form of mobilizing our forces. The Socialist Labor Party. For one thing, we considered joining the Socialist Labor Party. This organization, which had not yet degenerated into its present status as a narrow, counter-revolutionary sect, but then still had a revolutionary spirit, was completely dominated by Daniel de Leon, intellectually and otherwise. His theories constituted the program of the S.L. P. de Leon, born in Venezuela, was an intellectual, trained in the universities of Holland and Germany. He was a devoted and tireless fighter for the revolution as he understood it. He was also a brilliant writer, and from 1890 until his death in 1914 he exerted a greater theoretical influence upon the revolutionary movement than any other American intellectual before or since. De Leon's greatest contribution to the revolutionary movement was his elaborate and persistent exposure of right opportunism. His criticisms of the A.F.L. officials and the petty bourgeois leaders of the S.P. were scathing and won for him the undying hatred of these reactionaries. But beyond this criticism of reformism and the revolutionary spirit with which he carried it through, there was little valuable in the teachings of de Leon. When he attempted to develop a program, he fell into the grossest errors. He was a narrow sectarian dogmatist, and his theories, although containing elements of political action, led straight to the development of syndicalism. In fact, de Leon may be properly called the intellectual father of American syndicalism. The theoretical system of de Leon, as I have said, recognized a certain need for political action. But its fundamental trend was in the direction of syndicalism by its systematic underestimation of the RDLE of the party and overestimation of the labor unions before, during and after the revolution. This syndicalist tendency expressed itself in many ways. First, de Leon denied the utility of the everyday struggle for partial, immediate political demands. Not SOPs, said he, but unconditional surrender of capitalism, such as the fighting cry of the proletarian revolution. Concessions won were only so many banana peelings under the feet of the proletariat. Such a conception had the effect of reducing the party in the pre-revolutionary period to simply a talking machine, the real everyday fighting, which was for economic demands only, being delegated to the industrial unions. Secondly, de Leon naively believed that the revolution could be brought about simply by the parties building up a majority of votes in the national elections through a gradual process of education. Faced by the workers' majority, the overawed capitalists would yield, thought de Leon. But if by any mischance they did not, then the workers would call into play the real fighting organizations, the industrial unions, which would proceed to finish off the capitalists by locking them out. De Leon had no conception of the fierce and violent struggle the capitalists always make, illustrated by Russia, Germany, Spain, etc., before they can be defeated by the revolutionary proletariat led by its fighting. Stand the R61E of the capitalist state as the defender, by force of arms, of the power of the ruling capitalist class. Thirdly, de Leon taught that once the revolution was accomplished, the party would instantly dissolve itself and turn the management of the presumably immediately peaceful society over to the industrial unions. This was a further glorification of the RDLE of the unions and minimizing of that of the party. It was also an expression of de Leon's misapprehension of the transition period from capitalism to socialism, the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat and a time of acute class struggle against the remnants of the defeated classes. Characteristically syndicalistic was de Leon's statement. In a speech made in 1905, industrial unionism is at once the battering ram with which to pound down the fortress of capitalism and the successor of the capitalist social structure itself. In line with de Leon's main trend towards syndicalism was his notorious dual unionism and utopian speculations with ideal forms of industrial unions. De Leon looked upon the old craft unions as a sort of conspiracy of the capitalists and conservative labor leaders against the working class. With this sectarian conception, de Leon vigorously led several secessions of revolutionary elements from the A.F.L. and attempts to build up utopian dual unions, among which were the S.T. and L.A. 1895, I.W. 1905, and W.I.U. 1908. All three were failures, the only substantial effects of de Leon's dual unionism being to disastrously weaken the A.F.L. left wing and thus to leave the Gompersites more firmly in control of the trade unions. The essentially syndicalistic character of de Leon's whole outlook is clear. In his theories, the basic organs of the working class are the labor unions. As for the party, its role is only a secondary one, instead of one of central, decisive leadership. The whole revolutionary struggle is reduced practically to a trade union question. It was, therefore, only a short step for the true syndicalists of the I.W. Street, John, Haywood, Troutman, etc., all reared on de Leon's theories, to eventually sweep aside de Leon's thin ghost of a party conception and to set up instead a full system of Syndicalism by leaving theoretically the industrial unions alone in the field. It is true that de Leon fought bitterly against these direct actionists, but that was because he lacked the logic of his own premises. He was in the sad predicament of a hen who has hatched out a lot of ducklings and then watches in great alarm as they swim in the inviting water. De Leonism is not Marxism. It is basically syndicalism in the making. It has nothing in common with the Marxist-Leninist conception of the party, so brilliantly justified by the experience of the Russian Revolution, of the Workers' Party, the Communist Party, as the leader, organizer and vanguard of the working class and its allies in their daily battle under capitalism for minor demands, in their revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system, and in their construction of a socialist society. De Leonism leads not to the revolution, but away from it. Its end product, the present-day S.L.P., is a counter-revolutionary group, the very worst expression of the American sectarianism that Marx and Engels noted long ago. It is an enemy of the Soviet Union and of everything vital and revolutionary in the labor movement. It is the most isolated, sterile and feudal national party ever produced by the American working class, a pitiful monument indeed to the sincere and courageous fighter, de Leon. We form a new party. With the 1909 split on our hands in Washington, we had to make a decision as to our next step organizationally. Most of us, like left-wingers generally in that period, were saturated with the semi-syndicalist theories of de Leon. But we finally decided not to join the S.L.P. Its crass sectarianism repulsed us. We felt de Leon's dogmatic utopianism rather than analyzed it. We decided to form a new party, and we did. After much travail, the new party was launched in Seattle on February 25, 1910. Joseph Biscay was chosen secretary. The new organization called itself the Wage Workers' Party. As we shall see, the organization was short-lived, consequently it made only desultory formulations of policy and it made no real crystallization of its actual and potential organizational forces. No statistics of its membership were collected. The W.W.P. was a sort of hybrid between the S.L.P. and the I.W.W. It put in the center of its program its main demand in the fight within the S.P., that is, the W.W.P. sought to solve the question of proletarian versus petty bourgeois control of the party by restricting its membership solely to wage workers. It called itself a political union, and its membership provisions specifically excluded capital ISDS, lawyers, preachers, doctors, dentists, detectives, soldiers, factory owners, policemen, superintendents, foremen, professors and storekeepers. It barred all with power to hire and fire, but it evaded reference to farmers. The program placed the greatest stress upon industrial unionism, which in those times meant the I.W.W. It opposed the formation of a labor party. Its manifest anti-parliamentarism was but thinly veiled. It outlined no immediate political demands and showed no conception of the role of the party in fighting for such demands, in defending the workers' standards now and in educating and organizing the masses for revolutionary tasks ahead. The program contented itself with saying vaguely that it would support all struggles of the workers. The whole stress of the party work was placed upon industrial union action and revolutionary agitation and propaganda for the abolition of the capitalist system. There was no place in the class struggle for such an organization as the W.W.P., so it died as soon as it was born. The period from its formation to its collapse was only a few months. It got out only one issue of its paper, The Wage Worker, and then this died. The sudden split had confused our forces in Oregon and California and even in Washington. Also soon dropped out. Hardly any of the leading elements rejoined the S.Pages, or affiliated themselves to the S.L.P. Some, like Harry Alt, became A.F.L. bureaucrats, but the bulk, like Joe Manley, who later was to become my son-in-law, Floyd Hyde, Joe Biscay, myself, and many others, joined the I.W.W. Our de Leonist training had led us to a logical conclusion: syndicalism. A few remnants of the former W.W.P. group remained around Titus and advocated the shorter workday as the way to end capitalism. They soon split into two factions, one demanding the 4-hour day and the other the 3-hour day. Titus himself decided to become a proletarian. He gave up his physician's practice and for the next 20 years his occupation was that of an elevator operator. For several of these years Titus hoboed all over the country speaking to A.F.L. locals and pledging them to declare a general strike on a given day, years in advance, for the 4-hour day. He died in a New York hospital of cancer in 1931. As for myself, as I have said, I cast my lot in with the I.W.W. My failure to return to the Socialist Party was perhaps the greatest political mistake of my career. Although the S.P. as a whole was not a revolutionary party, neither in the U.S. nor abroad, as was soon to be graphically demonstrated by the events of the war and post-war years. Nevertheless, through its left wing, it was the chief bearer of the seeds of the eventual Revolutionary Party, the Communist Party. Thus it was out of the loins of the Second International that the Communist International was born. My abandonment of the S.P. therefore cut me off from the mainstream of this naive 4-hour day pledge, which many thousands of workers signed read. Beginning May 1925, I hereby agree not to work for wages more than 4 hours in any 24-hour day, or more than 24 hours in any calc. R. J. H. The understanding that 3/4 of the wage workers, degree the me. There was T0 greater than E organized. A universal, Indi, as asterisk or, a warring day short enough to abolish the capitalists' 1000 RFS F 1 inch 6, Ren. H.C. Fatarful May, 1925 greater than me. No workers struck. The filled square, 5 Ned Plar FBN T, 1 AGIU, I, HD. Lutionary development, the S.P. left wing, and sent me wandering for a dozen years in the sterile desert of syndicalism. The significance of the Wage Workers' Party, the W.P., was important in that it was one of the earliest crystallizations of the S.P. left wing, a forerunner of the big fight of 1912 and the eventual national S.P. split of 1919. It was a local skirmish in the worldwide fight of the revolutionary elements inside the S.P. against the reformist leadership. Already in old Russia the reformists had been decisively defeated, 1903, by the Bolsheviks under the leadership of Lenin, and a decade later, also under his leadership, the world struggle against the crippling reformism was to result in the formation of the Communist International. The W.P. was also important in its giving a picture of the ideological development of the left wing at this stage of its development. Its program was naive and ultra-left. Heavily influenced by de Leon's teachings, it saw in the party only an organization of revolutionary agitation and propaganda, instead of the leading fighting organ of the workers. It raised no immediate political demands and it was saturated with anti-parliamentarism. It was full of the current over estimation of the role of dual industrial unionism, and it ignored even the poor farmers, potential allies of the workers. There was a broad streak of syndicalism in its whole outlook. Characteristically, the W.P. also found a leftist solution to the question of the petty bourgeois intellectuals in the Party of the Toilers by excluding them altogether from membership. Thus it followed along the wrong path blazed by Bakunin and Proudhon many years before in the First International when they advocated, against Marx's bitter opposition, a similar policy. To break on principle with all intellectuals of bourgeois origin is incorrect and sentences the party to theoretical sterility. There must be a distinction made between those intellectual careerists who try to use the intellectuals who have identified themselves with the proletariat and who are carrying out the fundamental task of developing the revolutionary theory of the workers. On this question, Lenin says in his famous pamphlet, What is to be done? The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., it may realize the necessity for combining in unions, to fight against the employers and to strive to compel the government to pass necessary social legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals. The founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. The W.P. also displayed leftism in its concept of the revolutionary elements in the working class. Tom Slatton, in an article in the International Socialist Review, entitled, The Proletarian, gave voice to the prevailing misconceptions in this respect. He pictured the workers who would build the party and the revolution as necessarily quite homeless, familyless, jobless, penniless, godless and voteless. Such a conception, however, was simply a reflection of the well-known floating workers of the West who, full of revolutionary spirit, dominated the whole Western labor movement, but who were by no means representative of the broad working class. Such narrow concepts of the revolutionary forces as the W.P. had, would, of course, cut the party off from whole sections of the poorer farmers and petty bourgeoisie, and even from the bulk of the working class itself. Chapter V. The Industrial Workers of the World. I was not greatly enthused over the formation of the Wage Workers' Party, and even while it was being launched I was turning my attention to the industrial workers of the world. Specifically, I went from Seattle to Spokane in the fall of 190 grams to report the free speech fight there for Titus Workingman's paper, formerly the Seattle Socialist. The Spokane free speech fight was one of the very bitterest of the many such fights conducted by the I.W. The city authorities, to prevent the I.W. W from reaching the crowds of idle itinerant workers who lined the sidewalks, had passed a strict anti-street speaking ordinance in the I. W was trying to break it down by mass violation. There was issued a national call for volunteers, and hundreds had come to town to go to jail. The police met all attempts at speaking by brutal clubbing and wholesale arrests. In the early months of the struggle, the I.W. fighters refused to work out the 34-day sentences on the rock pile, whereupon they were put upon a bread and water diet and lodged in the freezingly cold Franklin School. This was a terrible regime, the ration consisting of only 2 ounces of white bread morning and evening. Result: serious intestinal disorders and actual starvation. A 34-day complete hunger strike would have been less disastrous than the horrible white bread diet. 3 men were so sickened that they died shortly after their release. About 600 were arrested in the fight, which lasted until March 1910. Immediately upon my arrival in Spokane, I joined actively in this struggle. I heartily endorsed the splendid fighting spirit of the I.W., which contrasted sharply with the wishy-washy S.P. I was arrested and served 2 months. While in jail, I joined the syndicalistic I.W. Upon my release, I was placed at the head of the committee which negotiated the settlement of the struggle. This resulted in an almost complete victory for the I.W., as the hated ordinance was killed. The basis of American syndicalism. Before proceeding further with my experience in the I.W., it may be well to explain what syndicalism is and why there has been so much of it in the American labor movement. Let me quote from an article of mine in the Communist, November 1935. In its basic aspects, syndicalism, or more properly, anarcho-syndicalism, may be defined very briefly as that tendency in the labor movement to confine the revolutionary class struggle of the workers to the economic field, to practically ignore the state, and to reduce the whole fight of the working class to simply a question of trade union action. Its fighting organization is the trade union, its basic method of class warfare is the strike, with the general strike as the revolutionary weapon, and its revolutionary goal is the setting up of a trade union, state, to conduct industry and all other social activities. Chief among the weaknesses of syndicalism are 1. Failure to provide the closely knit organization of the most developed revolutionary elements, which must be the Communist Party, indispensable for uniting and leading the less developed masses. 2. Failure to utilize the many political methods of struggle vitally necessary to carry on the workers' daily fight against the state and the capitalists for the eventual overthrow of capitalism, and for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. Failure to establish a basis for the unity of the workers with the poorer sections of the farmers and petty bourgeoisie against the capitalists, a unity fundamental for effective struggle against capitalism. 4. Failure to work out a practical plan for the operation of the workers' society after the abolition of capitalism. Thus, briefly, by preventing the revolutionary political organization of the workers, by hindering their developing political struggle, by alienating their natural class allies, and by confusing them regarding the future order of society, syndicalism demobilizes the workers politically before the attacks of the capitalist state, and it leads inevitably to the defeat of the working class in its revolutionary struggle. The American labor movement has been long and deeply afflicted with this anti-political syndicalism, very much more in fact than either Germany or England, comparable industrial countries. Beginnings of syndicalism were already to be seen in the Great 8-Hour Movement of 1886, with its general strike theories and anti-parliamentarism. Many of the dual industrial unions of the next 20 years displayed similar tendencies to exalt economic action and to play down political action. But the syndicalist tendency received its fullest expression in the Industrial Workers of the World, organized in 1905. A few years later came a lesser organization, the Syndicalist League of North America. The long-continued hostility of the old trade unions to working-class political action was a product of the basic forces that product the general syndicalist trend. The syndicalist tendency also showed itself very strongly in the left wing of the socialist movement by trends towards anti-parliamentarism, glorification of the daily role of labor unionism, whittling down the role of the party, theories of a trade union state after capitalism is overthrown, etc. The S.L.P. and the left wing of the S.P. collaborated in founding the syndicalistic I.W. The 3 outstanding revolutionary leaders of the period displayed strong syndicalist characteristics. De Leon, as we have seen, was the theoretical father of American syndicalism. Debs shared many of de Leon's syndicalistic illusions, and Haywood became an outright syndicalist. A striking illustration of the power of syndicalist tendencies in the S.P. was the fact that in the split of 1909 most of those leaving the party joined the I.W., and this was equally true of the far larger national S.P. split of 1912. In the big 1919 S.P. split that gave birth to the communist movement, the left wing was still afflicted with syndicalist tendencies, and if it did not degenerate into outright syndicalism, it was because of the presence of corrective influences which I shall consider shortly. The persistent and widespread syndicalist tendency had its roots in basic American conditions, in a whole series of economic, political and social factors, operating over a long period, European syndicalist influences being only a minor cause of it. These many American factors, by hindering the growth of class consciousness and checking the development of independent working-class political organization and active ITY, tended to restrict the struggle of the workers to the economic field and thereby to create the objective conditions favorable to the development of syndicalism. There was, first, the more favorable economic situation which checked the class consciousness of the American masses. This was evidenced by such deterrent factors as the existence of plentiful government-free land during several generations, the traditionally higher wage and living standards, the development of a very large and conservative labor aristocracy and corrupt trade union bureaucracy, the passage of large numbers of workers into the ranks of the petty bourgeoisie and many even into the big bourgeoisie during the long period of rapid industrial expansion, etc. These many economic factors tended powerfully to blur class lines, to create bourgeois property illusions among the workers, to stifle the class struggle of the masses and to predispose them to syndicalism. Then there must be added the widespread bourgeois democratic illusions among entire masses, set up by the fact that the American bourgeois revolution accorded the workers a relatively high degree of formal democratic rights of free speech, free press, free assembly, the right to organize and strike, the right to be elected to any office, the fiction of legalized social equality, etc. These rights had been won by the workers many years before, and no longer provided the cause for acute political struggle. C. And to serve as the basis for a mass political party. The grievances that the workers had, and they were many and urgent, loomed up to them chiefly as economic, questions of wages, hours, working conditions, etc. In the given historical situation, this is why the American workers have made their fight mainly on the economic field, why they were unable to build a mass socialist or labor party, and it formed an important basis for syndicalism. A number of other important factors also tended to check the American workers' political activity as a class and to encourage syndicalism, such as the decentralized character of the American government, which scattered the political efforts of the workers, the presence of great masses of disfranchised immigrants and floating workers interested chiefly only in economic questions and subject to strong non-political and anti-political moods, the heterogeneous character of the working class, many nations, races, religions, traditions, etc., which made class solidarity difficult, the notoriously corrupt American politics *, which disgusted many workers with political action generally, the ultra-reactionary regime in the A.F. of L, which repelled revolutionary workers from the old unions, and last but not least, the petty bourgeois control and reformist policies of the S.P., which drove many workers, myself included, out of the party and into syndicalism, as we have seen in the splits of 1909 and 1912. All the foregoing factors constituted the native soil in which the persistent deviation, syndicalism, grew in the United States, but of themselves they only created the objective possibilities for syndicalism. The actual development of American syndicalism into a system was directly caused by another, a subjective factor, the theoretical weakness of the left wing. This was the historical, left, sectarian tendency of not struggling against these anti-political forces, but of adapting itself to them and restricting its revolutionary. This acute political corruption originated principally in the wholesale bribery of legislators in connection with the stealing of the public domain, one of the special features of capitalist accumulation in America. Struggle to the economic field. There was no Lenin in America who could, in face of the many factors making against political action, hammer out a revolutionary political policy. Nor was the American left wing even informed regarding Lenin's work. As we have already seen, the left wing's most outstanding leaders over a period of 30 years, De Leon, Debs, Haywood, could do no better than help it lose itself in the syndicalist swamp. In the previous chapter, dealing with the S.L.P., I have discussed the main theoretical errors of the left wing which tended to the development of syndicalism. Briefly, these were 1. A great underestimation of the role of the party, especially by De Leon, which led straight to a repudiation of the party altogether by Haywood and other true syndicalists. 2. Exaggeration of the role of labor unions and syndicalistic speculations of bringing about the revolution by utopian dual industrial unions. 3. Misconceptions of the role of the state, especially the dictatorship of the proletariat, and also the elaboration of syndicalistic notions of conducting the future socialist society through a trade union state. Although the syndicalist tendency persisted long and vigorously in the United States, it has finally shrunk to a very minor factor. This is because the theoretical confusion upon which it was based has been mostly cleared up. The experience of the Russian Revolution and the consequent popularization of Lenin's writings through the Communist International exploded the old-time American syndicalist fallacies by demonstrating in practice the revolutionary role of the party, the subordinate function of the trade unions, the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. These basic truths, learned in the daily struggles, in the seizure of power and in the building of socialism in the U.S.S.R., were confirmed by the post-war revolutionary upheavals in Germany, Austria, Hungary, China, etc. The genuinely revolutionary forces in the United States were able to learn these. UD von UM-1 did, Y-re to help increase the lessons. Hence, with the organization of the Communist Party in 1919, which incorporated these fundamental political lessons in its program, American syndicalism suffered a mortal blow. The best revolutionary elements from the S. P. S. L. P. I. W. W. S. L. of N. A. Anarchists, etc., rallied to the Communist Party. The anti-political I. W. W. began to shrivel up. Other factors greatly helped this theoretical clarification to hasten the decline of the I. W. W., such as its dual unionism, overestimation of spontaneity and underestimation of organization, decentralized form, overemphasis on anti-religious propaganda, tendency to function more as a propaganda body and fighter for free speech than a labor union, placing of impossible demands in strikes, rigidity of tactics, sectarian refusal to learn from its own mistakes, and its counter-revolutionary attitude towards the Soviet Union, which alienated from it the most revolutionary workers. With the decline of the I. W. W., the syndicalist tendency generally passed rapidly into decay. And since that period the objective situation in the United States has also greatly changed. The whole class struggle has become more political, all of which facilitates organized class political action by the working class and checks the syndicalist tendency. But of that more in a later chapter. I. W. W. looks at European labor. Now let me resume my personal experiences in the I. W. W. It was chiefly discussed with the petty bourgeois leaders and policies of the S. P. that had made me join the I. W. W. The above analyzed weaknesses I could not see at the time. It was an easy step for me to conclude from the paralyzing reformism of the S. P. that political action in general was fruitless and that the way to working class emancipation was through militant trade union action, culminating in the general strike. This conclusion was a serious error, my confounding political action as such with S. P. opportunism, and thus casting aside the political weapons of the working class. It took me many years to correct this basic mistake. I was also drawn positively to the syndicalist point of view vis the influence of the militant I. W. W. and likewise as a result of the spectacular success of the General Confederation of Labor, C. G. T. of France. This syndicalist organization was at that time conducting a whole series of local and national general strikes that were stirring the workers in every country. Its theories of militant action, sabotage, general strike and of a new society operated by the trade unions appealed to me as the last word in revolutionary policy. I decided to go to France and study French syndicalism at first hand. So, early in 1910, with $100 in my pocket, I hoboed my way to New York and soon landed in Paris. I stayed 6 months in France and intensely studied the labor movement, gaining incidentally a speaking and reading knowledge of French. The C. G. T. leaders welcomed me, every door of the unions was open to me, and I read widely in Pelloutier, Griffules, Kritsky, Puget, Herved, Sorel, Bergson and many other syndicalist writers. I was in daily contact with such leaders as Jouot, Yvetot, Monnet, Merheim, all of whom at that time vied with each other in radicalism but who later on nearly all developed into war jingoists and reformists. I actively participated in the Great Railroad Strike of 1910, broken with troops by the ex-socialist Premier, Byran, and I attended the C. G. T. Congress in Toulouse. I drank in the French syndicalist theories of sabotage and general strike then being effectively applied by the labor unions. I heartily endorsed the bitter war of the C. G. T. militants against the S. P. and political action generally. The prevalent anarchistic theories of spontaneous action and decentralized organization of the workers appealed to me as a corrective to bureaucratic control of the trade unions by reactionaries. In short, I became a thorough syndicalist. I was deeply impressed by a basic feature of French syndicalism, new to me and quite contrary to I. W. policy. This was the tactic of boring from within, the policy of militant workers penetrating conservative unions, rather than trying to construct new, ideal, industrial unions on the outside. By this means the anarchists, beginning with their famous raid on the unions in the 90s, had defeated the reformist socialists and captured almost the entire French trade union movement. And in doing so they had transformed themselves as well as the unions. Instead of their original anarchist policy of individual action, They adopted the trade unions and mass action. They acquired some conception, however confused, of the class struggle. They took part in the daily fights of the workers. They glorified sabotage and looked forward to the general strike to end capitalism. They achieved their theories of a future society based on the trade unions. In short, syndicalism, or more correctly, anarcho-syndicalism, was born. The policy of boring from within was based in the C.G.T. upon the theory of the militant minority. According to this conception, the most revolutionary elements among the masses, the natural leaders of the workers, organized themselves into definite groups, noyo, within the broad trade unions. These groups enabled them to function as a unit in formulating their policies and putting them into effect. It was through this organized militant minority that the revolutionary syndicalists controlled the French trade unions. It seemed to me that the boring from within tactic and the theory of the militant minority were highly intelligent and far superior to the I.W. policy of building dual industrial unions, and also to its naive theory that there were no leaders in the organization, all the members being leaders. So I resolved to raise these two questions in the I.W. when I returned to the United States, and the sequel showed that they were to play a very large part in my future labor activities. From France I went to Germany, where I also stayed 6 months, intensively studying the labor movement and incidentally the German language. I lived at the home of Fritz Kater, head of the German Syndicalist Union. I read constantly histories, programs, convention reports, etc., of the trade unions and the Social Democratic Party. I frequented mass meetings, strike meetings and conventions, becoming acquainted with most of the outstanding party and union leaders, including the later to be renegade Karl Kautsky and the eventual revolutionary hero, Karl Liebknecht. At that time, early in 1911, the German Social Democratic movement, facing a stalemate in its fight to win the franchise for the masses by parliamentary means, was considering the possibility of securing the right to vote through a general strike. The mass pressure for such a strike was great, under the powerful influence of the general strike of the 1905 Russian Revolution in the East and the dramatic general strikes of syndicalism in the West, in France. A bitter inter-party fight took place over this issue, and in this struggle the reformists, who were inspired by Bernstein and led by Legion and who dominated both the party and the unions, won so fully that they even forbade the discussion of the general strike in the trade unions. This course of development convinced me that the German social democracy and all its subordinate organizations and similar parties in other countries were a definite obstacle in the way of the revolution, and I so wrote in articles to the I.W. Press. And my opinions in this respect were to be confirmed only a few years later by these parties' support of the war and their violent suppression of the post-war revolutionary upheavals. With such an opinion of the social democracy, I wrongly criticized the policy of the left wing led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, for their not repudiating the SDP altogether and launching a syndicalist movement on the French model. My experience in Germany fortified my syndicalist opinions. The manifestly non-revolutionary Social Democratic Party and the conservative mass unions and cooperatives under its control convinced me further of the necessity of a revolutionary syndicalist policy. Furthermore, the sectarian isolation of the German Syndicalist Union convinced me that by withdrawing from old unions on the I.W. plan, they were simply turning the mass trade unions over to Legion's deadly control, and that good tactics required the use of boring from within methods. I was led to conclude that the policy of dual unionism was wrong not only in Germany, but also in the United States. Having finished my scheduled 6-month stay in Germany, I was hastily picking up a reading knowledge of Italian and Spanish preparatory to spending 6 months each in Italy and Spain, when I was cabled by Vincent Street John, General Secretary of the I.W., to represent that organization at the meeting of the International Trade Union Secretariat, forerunner of the Amsterdam International, to be held in Budapest, Hungary, August 10 to 12, 1911. As I was broke, I had to walk 150 miles of the way there, from Nuremberg to Dresden, Germany. In Dresden I attended the National Congress of the German Trade Unions and saw Legion's ironclad bureaucracy in action. The A.F. of L had sent Vice President Duncan as its delegate to Budapest, and I was instructed to challenge his credentials upon the basis that the A.F. of L was not a revolutionary organization and that Duncan was a member of the National Civic Federation, and to demand the seating of the I.W. as representing the American labor movement. Karl Legion was chairman of the conference, and he tried to rule out all discussion on my rather leftist proposal. But I forced the matter before the House. A bitter full day's debate ensued, and I was finally voted down, only the 2 delegates of the C.G.T. Jauo and Yvetot, supporting my motion. That night, as I had no funds for food or lodging, I was arrested for sleeping in a moving van on the outskirts of Budapest. However, I managed to talk myself out of this scrape on the basis that I had lost my expense money. The trench delegates pressed a small loan on me, and in a day or two I received a cable from St. John to come home immediately to attend the forthcoming I.W. convention, which I did. The question of boring from within. I was determined to raise the question in the I.W. of boring from within the old trade unions and of giving up the traditional left-wing policy of dual unionism. But this was tackling a hard problem, for at that time the notion was deeply entrenched that no revolutionary work could be done inside die reactionary A.F. of L, and that the only way to create revolutionary unions was by building new and independent organizations. Since about 1895, when de Leon founded the Dual Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance, all sections of the left-wing left socialists, anarchists, syndicalists had clung to this theory of dual unionism with the most positive belief. The right-wing socialists, although many worked within the old unions, were also infected with the same idea. Indeed, even liberal intellectuals reflected it. It is difficult now, when boring from within is a generally accepted left-wing policy, to realize the terrific grip the erroneous dual union theory then had upon the revolutionists. The question was simply a closed one, undiscussable, even to raise a branded one as a rank opportunist. De Leon, Debs and Haywood, the three big left leaders, continually flayed the old trade unions in unmeasured terms and declared as a matter of profound revolutionary strategy that the path to militant revolutionary unionism lay through independent industrial unions. But, plainly, the experience of the class struggle did not bear out either this pessimism towards the old unions or the current boundless left-wing faith in the ideal industrial unions, of which the I.W. was the shining example. On the one hand, this experience taught clearly that where real efforts had been made in the old unions, the workers had responded, notwithstanding their corrupt leaders. In 1886, for example, the Great 8-Hour Day movement had been organized by a handful of revolutionists working on the basis of stirring up and building the old unions. Debs himself had also been a real power in the railroad craft unions before. He split from them in 1893 and embarked upon his course of dual unionism. And de Leon had likewise exerted a powerful influence in the K of L and A.F. of L in the 90s, notwithstanding his leftist dualist tendencies. Haywood, too, years before had had no great difficulty in becoming the real leader of the militant Western Federation of Miners. And even at the period of which I am writing, the Socialist Party, despite being heavily afflicted with dual unionist tendencies, was making substantial progress in the A.F. of L. This, however, was mostly the work of its opportunistic right wing, which had its eyes fastened on official posy-tie-ons and vote-catching. The socialists had already secured control of such unions as the brewery workers, bakers, machinists, needle trades, and the vice president of the militant U.M.W.A. was a socialist. In the 1912 A.F. of L. convention, the socialist candidate polled 5,073 votes against Gomper's 11,974. This American experience, which emphasized the correctness of working within the old unions, was further borne out by the experience of the revolutionary movements in France, England, Germany, Russia, etc. Undoubtedly, the lack of a definite policy of boring from within, based on a militant fight for the workers' daily demands, prevented the S.P. from securing the leadership of the trade unions in the pre-war years. Sufficient proof of this was the substantial progress made in this direction by the opportunist right wing, although the powerful left was in dual unionist opposition, and even the right wing itself was skeptical of actually capturing the A.F. of L, and was constantly paralyzed by the conflicting policies of the two wings of the party. Another major mistake preventing the rise of socialist leadership in the trade unions was the refusal of the socialists to raise the slogan of a labor party based on the unions and their sectarian insistence upon endorsement of the S.P. itself as the party of the trade unions. Further discrediting the dualist theory, many attempts to found dual industrial unions had failed to develop mass organizations. Time and again de Leon, Debs, Haywood and other left-wing leaders had pronounced the old trade unions dying or even dead, and this was an easy conclusion to arrive at, in view of their reactionary leaders and policies, craft forms' high dues and initiation fees, exclusion of the unskilled workers, and their general unfitness to cope with modern, trustified industry. But the workers, although they readily supported the radicalism that developed within their old unions, stubbornly refused to turn their backs on these organizations, with their traditions and practical benefits. They would not respond to the alluring appeals of the perfect, revolutionary dual industrial unions. So de Leon S.T. and L.A. became a dismal fiasco. Debs A.R. Uperisht. The Western Labor Union and its successor, the American Labor Union, also failed, and many other independent industrial unions in single industries died out, despite heroic efforts of devoted left-wingers to breathe the breath of life into them. And at the time in question, the I.W. in spite of all efforts, had steadily declined from 55,000 members in 1905 to about 6,000 in 1911. It had split in 1908, the De Leon faction launching a new I.W.W., and it was evidently traveling the usual path of the revolutionary dual unions to defeat. The general effect of this dual union policy, which prevailed as a dogmatic left-wing gospel for 25 years, was to pull the militants, the most active workers, out of the mass trade unions and to isolate them in sterile dual union sects. The result was to leave the Gompers' reactionary clique in uncontested control of the craft unions and to kill progress in these organizations at its source by depriving them of their best fighting blood. This ill-advised left-wing policy was a disastrous mistake, and it did very much to check the growth of radicalism generally in the United States by reducing it to sectarianism. The dual unions obviously had theoretically more correct policies, a better union structure, superior leadership, etc., than the old craft unions. To dual unionists, therefore, it always remained pretty much of a mystery why the masses did not flock to their ideal unions rather than stick to the obsolete and conservative craft unions with their corrupt officials. Yet the reasons were quite clear. The more important of them may be briefly summarized as follows. A. The politically undeveloped masses of workers, full of capitalist illusions, were not ready to rally to the revolutionary slogans of the dual unions. B. The employers were inclined to make compromises with the conservative trade unions, whereas they fought the revolutionary unions to a standstill. C. The government was less hostile to the trade unions than to the radical dual unions. D. The A.F. of L enjoyed the important prestige of being the traditional labor movement of the country. E. The masses, animated by a basic sense of labor unity, gravitated towards the large mass organization, rather than towards the small dual groupments. F. And last but not least, the old trade unions had the vital advantage of speaking the same language as the broad masses in respect of religion, patriotism and general American traditions, while the dual unionist revolutionaries were usually anti-religious, anti-patriotic and altogether scornful of American traditions in general. The basic advantage of boring from within as a method over dual unionism was that the militants, by being inside the old unions, negated altogether the adverse effects of several of the above strong mass opinions and predilections and greatly modified those of the rest, with the general result that the militants had a better approach to the workers and were thus enabled to win to their side large and ever-decisive masses of them for policies of class struggle. The fight begins. I arrived in Chicago in time for the 6th convention of the I.W.W., which was held in September 1911, and I at once took up the question of winning the I.W.W. for a policy of boring from within. When I later put my proposition into print, it read as follows. The I.W. shall give up its attempt to create a new labor movement, turn itself into a propaganda league, get into the organized labor movement and, by building better fighting machines within the old unions than those possessed by our reactionary enemies, revolutionize these unions. I began an active campaign in favor of this fundamental change of policy, and the existing situation in the I.W.W. was favorable to my agitation. The glowing hopes of the 1905 convention had not materialized. The organization had gradually dwindled in numbers and influence. The convention had only 31 delegates. Ideologically, the I.W.W. had narrowed down pretty much to a small group of hard-boiled anti-political, anti-religious sectarians. Debs had quitted and De Leon likewise, both having split off when the I.W.W. rejected political action. Pessimism was rampant in the organization, and the question, why don't the I.W.W. grow, was a live issue. At once I won over to my view J. W. Johnston, Earl C. Ford and 2 or 3 other delegates. Frank Little, later lynched in Butte for opposition to the war during a strike of 27,000 workers led by Bill Dunn, expressed sympathy with our plan. But the top leaders, whom I interviewed one by one, Street, John, Eder, Thompson, Troutman, etc., Arvier all a stonewall against it. Some time later Bill Haywood agreed, in principle, that the I.W. should exempt some industries from its dual union program, but we could not agree on a practical application. I proposed as a start towards a correct policy that the I.W. dissolve its dual unions in mining, building, metal, printing and railroads and go to work inside the old unions in these industries, but Big Bill would concede only building and printing. We deemed it inadvisable to bring our proposal before the convention in resolution form on such short notice and without preparation and thus get a black eye for it by a sure defeat. We would first agitate it among the membership. Our chance to do so came when the decentralizer faction of the West nominated me for editor of the Spokane Industrial Worker, to be elected on referendum vote. As my platform, I called for a discussion of the boring from within policy. The leadership, who had called me back from Budapest, now turned all their guns against me. The discussion aroused the whole organization. Asterisk, but the official vote count showed that I lost by a few votes. Later on I learned that administration supporters had padded their vote sufficiently to defeat me. Occasionally the discussion took a humorous turn, as witness the following verses from a poem entitled Holiness by McClintock. "The proper way," said Jay the Fox. "Agreed," cried Mr. Foster. "To start the revolution, I have my gimlet ready, is just to bore a hole or two. My arm is long, my hand is strong. In existing institutions, my nerves are cool and steady." In reality, however, the I.W.W. reached a higher membership total in 1917, when it officially claimed 130,000 members. Meanwhile, an important event was developing, one that effectively crippled the budding boring from within agitation in the I.W.W. This was the famous I.W.W. Lawrence strike in January 1912, of 23,000 textile workers. It was hard-fought, well-led, and resulted in a real victory for the workers. I.W.W. stocks went skyward again everywhere, and it grew rapidly. Within a short period afterward, the organization conducted a whole series of important strikes in Patterson, Akron, Little Falls, Lytton, Mesaba Iron Range, Washington lumber districts, etc. This sudden wave of strikes, many of which won contest scions, brought the I.W.W. to what Brissenden calls its crest of power. Pessimism vanished and the I.W.W. militants were jubilant. Street. John declared enthusiastically. The victory in the Lawrence Mills means the start that will only end with the downfall of the capitalist system. In such a situation, our question of, why don't the I.W.W. grow, fell flat? A new wave of dual unionist sentiment spread in all sections of the whole left wing. Only a few of us looked upon the spurt of the I.W.W. correctly as but a flash in the pan. The question of boring from within had received a body blow at the very outset. But this was not to be the end of the fight. We were to carry it on for another 10 years in the left wing generally until finally it scored a smashing victory. Chapter V. The Syndicalist League of North America, DVR.NG. The I.W.W. convention. We had held several meetings and resolved upon the following course. We would curve on a wide campaign in the I.W.W. to win it to the policy of boring from within. Chicago was selected as our natural center and I as national secretary of the militant minority groups that were to be formed. In pursuance of this plan, I made a 6,000-mile hobo trip through the West in the dead of winter, speaking to I.W.W. locals. I froze my face and hands and several times narrowly escaped death under the car wheels. However, at several points important militants were won over and local syndicalist groups formed within the I.W.W. But just as I was in the midst of this tour came the Lawrence strike and with it the greatly renewed I.W.W. enthusiasm. Thenceforward our agitation in the I.W.W. was quite barren. The revival of the I.W.W. dual union sentiment caused a change in our tactics. Our newly formed groups began to split off from the I.W.W. and to join the A.F.L. to work there. The first to take this course was local Syndicalist League No. 1, in Nelson, B.C., which had been formed by J.W. Johnston. It was only a short while afterward until we had similar groups within the A.F.L. in Kansas City, Omaha, Chicago, Minneapolis, Vancouver, B.C. Street, Louis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Tacoma, Denver and several other cities in Middle West and West. As for myself, I paid my last dues to the I.W.W. in February 1912. I was working as a railroader and I joined the A.F.L. union of my craft, the Brotherhood Railway Carmen of America, in Chicago. Work came, as we have seen, almost entirely from the I.W.W. We had practically no contact with the left wing of the Socialist Party, which was saturated with I.W.W. dual union sentiment. But we did get some very important recruits from the proletarian wing of the dwindling anarchist movement, including J. Fox, Joe Manley, S. T. Hammers Mark, etc. Fox brought his paper, The Agitator, with him. He was a veteran Chicago labor fighter, dating back to Haymarket days. As for the petty bourgeois, bohemian, Emma Goldman, anarchist group, they, with an eye to the experience of the anarchist raid on the unions in France, tried to take the wind out of our sails by starting a syndicalist league of their own. But nothing came of the attempt. One of the anarchists who joined our movement was Esther Abramowitz, who in 1912 became my wife. She was born in the old Russian province of Kovno and came to the United States in her early girlhood, where she long worked in a factory under sweatshop conditions. All her adult life she has been a most ardent revolutionist. She is one of those to whom the workers' struggle is the very breath of life. By an earlier marriage she had 3 children, Rebecca, Sylvia and David. She joined the Communist Party in 1921. An intelligent and devoted comrade, she has been my constant companion and a tower of strength to me in all my labor activities for these many years. Our new movement was too weak to call a national conference or convention. So, in agreement with the outlying groups, the Chicago Local League acted as the national body. It selected an executive board and elected me as national, in Mother Earth, September 30, 1912, a manifesto signed by A. Berkman, W. Sanger, Margaret Sanger, H. Havel and E. Byrne, proposed the establishment of a syndicalist league. The aim and object of the league should be the reconstruction of society upon a cooperative basis by a system of federated groups with the widest possible liberty for the individual in contradistinction to state control of industry. The method of propaganda should be direct action in the general strike and be distinctly non-political, using the word political in the sense of parliamentary. Secretary. The organization was formerly called the Syndicalist League of North America, this international title being due to the fact that the league included groups in Canada and hoped to extend its activities also into Mexico. Thus was born the first definite organization in the INITCD states born from within the trade unions by revolutionaries. The League adopted a structure calculated to organize the militant minority in the old trade unions. It set up local general leagues in the various industrial centers. These leagues were based upon individual memberships, the members subdividing themselves into craft or industrial groups of militants, according to the structure of their respective unions. True to our theories of decentralization, these local groups were highly autonomous. The various groups elected what funds they saw fit, issued their own journals, and worked out their local policies. The national office received no per capita tax, but depended upon the sale of its journal, pamphlets, collections, etc., for revenue. I got no salary. I worked at my trade as a car inspector, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The program of the S.L. of N.A. The formal statement of Die S.L. of N.A. program was contained in 2 documents, the first a brief outline of principles and constitution adopted by the Chicago League, and the other the pamphlet Syndicalism, written by Earl C. Ford and myself. The program was further elaborated in the rather extensive S.L. of N.A. press, which included its official organ, The Syndicalist, published semi-monthly in Chicago and edited by J. Fox, The Toiler, a monthly of Kansas City, The Unionist, a weekly of St. Louis, The International, a monthly of San Diego, and The Unionist of Omaha. Besides this press, the S.L. of N.A. militants widely used the columns of the trade union journals for propaganda articles. In the main, the S.L. of N.A. program followed the genmes of French syndicalism, while aiming at the overthrow of the capitalist class and the confiscation of the industries. It also strove to win all possible current concessions from capitalism. It fought for higher wages, shorter hours, and better living and working conditions. It advocated the 6-hour day. To win its immediate demands, the S.L. of N.A. relied not only on the partial strike but also laid great stress upon sabotage in all its forms, from passive resistance and go-slow tactics to active impairment of products and disablement of industry. At that time sabotage was looked upon among syndicalists generally as a most powerful weapon, and the official journal of the S.L. of N.A. ran a special column, under the heading, Society Notes, giving detailed information to workers on how to sabotage their respective jobs and industries during strikes. The major weapon of the S.L. of N.A. program was the general strike. It advocated the general strike to force partial concessions directly from the bosses in the government, to put an end to war, and as the revolutionary means that would finally overthrow capitalism. The S.L. of N.A. was strongly anti-parliamentary. It opposed participation in elections and in the government. Parliamentary action it considered as a waste and misdirection of the workers' forces. To win both its economic and political demands it relied solely upon the economic power of the workers, expressed through strikes, sabotage, etc. It aggressively opposed the S.P. and all other workers' political parties. The S.L. of N.A. advocated industrial unionism, but it laid less stress upon this organization form than did the I.W.W., which made a fetish out of the question of union structure. The S.L. of N.A. depended more upon raising the militancy of the workers, who would then, by force of their spontaneity, create solidarity of action regardless of the organization form of their unions and the conservative nature of their officials. The S.L. of N.A., which favored the decentralized form of union, proposed to bring about revolutionary industrial unionism by the amalgamation of related craft unions, the breaking down of high dues and initiation fees, the organization of the unorganized, the elimination of the conservative leadership and the revolutionary education of the rank and file. The League based itself upon the strategy of boring from within the conservative mass trade unions. Its membership was confined to members of these organizations. It resolutely fought the dual unionist policy of withdrawing the militants from the mass conservative unions and isolating them in perfect, but skeleton and sectarian, dual industrial unions. The working principle of the S.L. of N.A. was that of the militant minority. It sought to create organized groups of the most conscious revolutionary elements in all the trade unions. It declared, the militant minority is the thinking and acting part of the working class. It works out the fighting programs and takes the lead in putting them into effect. The organized militants were the little leaven that leavened the whole lump. The foregoing principles of the S.L. of N.A. were generally in line with French syndicalism, but in one important respect our League deviated from the French. This was in the matter of the role of the trade unions in the new society. The French formula, which fitted essentially with that of the I.W., had it that, the fighting unions of today will be the producing groups of tomorrow. This the S.L. of N.A. disputed vehemently, arguing that trade unions are quite unfitted for carrying on industry. We asserted that industry has a distinct organization of its own, the combined workers, engineers, etc., which we called the producing organization. We argued, the superiority of the pro-ducking organization to the labor union as a producing force is apparent at a glance. The producing organizations are especially designed to carry on production. The labor unions, on the other hand, are built for entirely different purposes. They are essentially organs of combat. We contended that the producing organization of technicians, workers, etc., spontaneously developed by capitalist industry, would survive the revolution and be the basis for the organization of the industry of the new society. The S.L. of N.A. program shows that, together with the influence of French syndicalism, the organization drew many of its conceptions from anarchist sources. In fact, we defined syndicalism as anarchism made practical. The League consciously considered itself the continuer of the traditions of the Great Struggle of '86, led by the anarcho-syndicalists, Parsons, Spies, et al., and we were in constant touch with many of the veterans of that heroic fight, including Lucy Parsons, at whose home we gathered and where we maintained the League's address. As for myself, during this period I fared far afield into anarchist and semi-anarchist writings. While I still accepted, or believed I did, the revolutionary economics, class struggle and historical materialism of Marx, I quibbled with his revolutionary strategy, organizational system and proposals for a socialist society. Correct answers to these questions I thought were to be found in the major works, all of which I read, of such writers as Bakunin, Kropotkin, Nietzsche, Max Stirner, Lester F. Ward, etc., as well as the syndicalist writers previously mentioned. My ideological development took a definite sag in the direction of anarchism. I became, in truth, an anarcho-syndicalist. Activities of the S.L. of N.A. The S.L. of N.A. lasted 2 years, from 1912 to 1914. This was a period of growing struggle by the workers, under the impact of the prevalent industrial crisis. The A.F. of L. unions grew rapidly and conducted several important strikes. The I.W. had a heyday of growth and struggles. The S.P. increased its membership from 41,479 in 1909 to 118,045, and in 1912 its vote was the largest in its history. And all this in spite of Roosevelt's efforts to demoralize the toiling masses with his Bull Moose campaign. The strongest point of the S.L. of N.A. was in Kansas City, where it had practical control of the cooks, barbers, office workers and other unions. The League militants they conducted several very successful strikes, marked with much militancy and sabotage. Their prestige rose so much that soon they virtually controlled the Central Labor Council. They conducted a general organizing campaign, a labor-forward movement that brought in large numbers of members and built several new A.F. of L locals. In their war against the labor fakers, an auditing committee headed by Earl Browder, present-day General Secretary of the Communist Party, submitted a report that compelled Nelson, the crooked Gompersite head of the Labor Council, to leave town between suns. In St. Louis the League was headed by J.A. LaBille and it led several militant A.F. of L strikes of taxi drivers, waiters, etc. In Omaha, with B. McCaffrey and D. Coots leading, the League became a power in the local labor movement but did not gain control. In Nelson, B. C. the League forces, with Jack Johnston at their head, practically controlled the A. F. of L locally. In Chicago, the League gained a broad influence in many unions, such as the railway carmen, painters, barbers, retail clerks, etc., and laid the basis for a group of militants that was to play a very important role in the Chicago Federation of Labor for many years. In various Pacific Coast cities the League had forces, and in Seattle many of its militants played leading parts in the general strike of a few years later. Nationally, the S.L. of N.A. actively participated in the Illinois Central Harriman Line's shop crafts strike of 38,000 workers, stretching from Chicago to the Gulf and the Pacific. This great strike, pushed forward by a strong rank and fife minority close to the S.L. of N.A., and headed by Carl Persons and C.A. Hoover, was extremely hard fought. It began in September 1911, and when it was called off 4 years later in June 1915, there were still pickets around the I.C. shops in Chicago. The strike, fought for the right of the shop crafts to federate, was broken, but the sequel showed that the right of federation had nevertheless been won on the railroads generally. The S.L. of N.A. stoutly defended the McNamara boys, arrested for dynamiting the Los Angeles Times building. October 1, 1910. How these loyal fighters were tricked by their friends, relatives, lawyers and labor officials into making a courageous but ill-advised plea of guilty in order to save the trade unions from attack and many union leaders from prosecution is one of the most tragic stories in the history of the American labor movement. Today, 25 years later, J. B. McNamara, one of the bravest and most loyal fighters ever developed by the working class, and with him the bold Matt Schmidt, is still wasting away his life behind the grim walls of Folsom Penitentiary. Is it not high time that the workers secured the release of these indomitable militants? The S.L. of N.A. conducted a rank-and-file movement among the iron molders. Our leader was Tom Mooney, then a young militant but later to become famous as a brutally victimized political prisoner. Together, Mooney and I attended the Milwaukee Convention of the Molders in 1912, he as a delegate, to bring forward the League program of industrial unionism through the organization of machine molders and laborers and the amalgamation of the metal trades. At the convention Mooney organized the National Molders section of the S.L. of N.A., later putting out charters for local groups, issuing dues stamps, etc. One of the important activities of the S.L. of N.A. was the national tour of Tom Mann in 1913, which was a great success. Mann was fresh from the recent huge strikes of miners, dockers and railroad men in Great Britain. He had been brought to the U.S. by the S.P. left wing, but when they saw that he endorsed the S.L. of N.A. boring from within program they dropped him cold, whereupon our League organized his tour. Tom Mann took issue with Debs, Haywood and others on the question of dual unionism. Thenceforth, the S.L. of N.A. remained in close touch with the Industrial Syndicalist League of Great Britain, of which he was the head, and we sent a delegate to the abortive International Syndicalist Conference in London. In 1913-14, the International Union of Timber Workers conducted a general strike movement in the Pacific Northwest for the 8-hour day to become effective on May 1, 1914. In this Union League forces were strong. J. Fox, our national editor, was a vice president, and I myself became an organizer of the Union for a few months in the summer of 1914. I was in the midst of one of my periodic hobo agitation trips and was induced to help in the 8-hour day campaign in the woods and mills, which our forces had done much to stimulate. The work had progressed well, but a few months previously the promising movement had been wrecked by a maneuver of the right-wing Socialist Party in Washington. Just as the workers were streaming by thousands into the Union, preparatory for a general strike on May 1, the S.P. introduced an 8-hour bill in the state legislature. Then the S.P. forces in the Union started a referendum endorsing the bill and rejecting the general strike, arguing that it was useless for the timber workers to strike for the 8-hour day when they could get it simply by voting. Local after local declared for the bill and against the strike. Whereupon, the Union officials, instead of adopting the necessary course of supporting both the general strike and the 8-hour bill, called a special convention which voted off the strike. This was disastrous. Not only was the strike killed, but the 8th bill was also later overwhelmingly defeated. In consequence, the lumber workers were demoralized and the Union eventually destroyed. Another important situation in which the S. L of N. A. Had some hand was the revolt of the Butte miners against the reactionary Moyer bureaucracy of the Western Federation of Miners in June 1914. The miners seized the Butte local, drove the company-controlled officials out of town, and proceeded to set up a new union. Passing through Butte at the time, I had a conference with Mucky, McDonald, Thump's son and other rank-and-file leaders, and I argued with them that with the key Butte local now in their hands they could easily, by staying inside, take over the whole W. F. of M. But, filled with W dualism, they would not listen. They launched their new union. The inevitable fratricidal struggle between the two unions took place, and soon Butte, long a citadel of trade unionism, became an open shop camp. A tragic example of the folly of dual unionism. The S. L. of N. A. kept up a ceaseless struggle against the deeply rooted dual union illusions that crippled the whole left wing and turned over the trade unions, uncontested, to the Gompers machine. We were inveterate enemies of this policy of withdrawing the militants from the mass unions and placing them in perfect, but skeleton, sectarian dual industrial unions. We were in constant hot water with the W and the S. P. left wing on this point. One of our major controversies was with Debs, who was an ardent dual unionist. Although he, just a few months before, had endorsed the Detroit W, he then suddenly reversed his attitude towards that organization and came out with still another plan for a general secession from the A. F. of L, which never materialized. He said, in the Miners magazine, May 7, 1914. It is vain to talk about the W. The Chicago faction, it now seems plain, seems to stand for anarchy. So be it. Let all those who oppose political action and favor sabotage and the program of anarchism join that faction. The Detroit, de Leon, faction, for reasons not necessary to discuss here, will never amount to more than it does today. A new organization must be built, with the miners, the leading industrial body, at the head of the movement. Despite its considerable activities, the S. L. of N. A. did not succeed in becoming a mass organization. Also, it never penetrated the industrial East, being almost entirely located in the territory west of Chicago, the traditional W stronghold. It was composed chiefly of skilled workers, mostly native-born. No accurate statistics were kept, but its actual membership of militants was estimated at not to exceed 2,000, although the unions led by these militants easily counted 10 to 20 times that many workers. The League's influence, especially in view of its relatively large press, was far greater than its small membership would indicate. After 2 years of life the S. L. of N. A. fell into decline. In the summer of 1914 its national center was liquidated and the movement crumbled away into disconnected groups of militants working here and there in the trade union movement. Criticism of the S. L. of N. A. program. The S. L. of N. A. program exhibited the basic flaw of the syndicalist movement in general. That is, it constituted a great oversimplification of the workers' revolutionary problem in both theory and practice. The syndicalist oversimplification takes the form of trying to ignore the capitalist state by disregarding the workers' need for a revolutionary political party and for political action, and by seeking to cramp the whole organization and struggle of the working class within the scope of trade union action. Thus, the class struggle front of the workers is narrowed down and the workers are crippled in their fight for democratic rights, social insurance, etc. They are denied the advantages of parliamentary election struggles, the use of the government legislatures as tribunes from which to speak to the masses, and the ideologically clarifying effect of the general political struggle. They are prevented from setting up alliances with potential allies among the farmers, petty bourgeoisie and the oppressed Negro people. In short, syndicalism politically disarms the workers and emasculates their struggle in the face of the capitalist enemy. Ample experience teaches that in practice it leads either to defeat in open struggle or to surrender through opportunist reformism. A fundamental aspect of syndicalist, including W. oversimplification is to be found in its general strike the ors. Its notion that the workers can stop a war or carry out the revolution by a folded arms strike. Thus the S. L. of N. A. program said, the power of the workers to control industry is the greatest force in modern society. The workers would have but to temporarily cease work as a class to overthrow the master capitalist class and free themselves. But the Russian, German and other revolutions made clear the fact, and recent fascist developments clinch it, which Marx, Engels and Lenin demonstrated long ago, that the capitalist class can never be finally defeated except by the superior force of the workers and other toilers. The general strike can and must be used effectively in war and revolutionary situations, but of itself it cannot bring about the revolution. Syndicalist and reformist socialist theories of folded arms general strikes can only lead the workers to surrender or to slaughter. The S. L of N. A's syndicalist theories of decentralized organization and spontaneous action by the workers were also wrong and a hindrance to the development of solid organization and persistent struggle. Furthermore, its heavy stress upon sabotage would open the union doors to provocateurs and tend to substitute the action of a few daring individuals for broad mass action. Also the S. L of N. A. Leftist direct attacks upon the workers' nationalistic feelings and their religion also needlessly alienated the masses of workers afflicted with such illusions and made for sectarianism. The League's theory of the militant minority, however, had a sound core and was a big advance over the current I.W.W. conceptions. But the syndicalist militant minority, hamstrung by the limitations of direct action, theory, organization and practice, inevitably remains only a feeble forecast of the true vanguard of the working class, the Communist Party, with its broad political program and its organized groups of fighters, not only in the trade unions but also in the shops, farms, army, schools, government, etc. The boring from within policy of the S. L of N. A. was basically correct and vastly superior to the prevalent left-wing, dual union fantasies. But the S. L of N. A. sometimes applied it too narrowly by failing to work systematically within such dual unions as were existing at the time. The S. L of N. A. theory of the producing organization that would operate industry in the new society was also an advance over the current syndicalist conception that the future industries would be operated by the trade unions. In the Soviet Union today, the industries are conducted by economic bodies under the direction of the state, and somewhat akin to our producing organizations, while the trade unions, insofar as they deal directly with the industrial processes, play only an auxiliary role in production. Early in the revolution, the syndicalist theory of the unions running the industries proved itself futile. Although our producing organization theory contained an element of truth, there was also a twofold error in the League's conception. This was a failure to understand the role of the party and Soviets under the dictatorship of the proletariat and 2. A naive underestimation of the capitalist resistance to the revolution, evidenced by the League's assuming that the capitalist economic organization, with minor changes, would go on over into the new society. The fact is, as the U.S.S.R. now shows clearly, the whole economic organization has to be rebuilt into a socialist industrial organization of industry and agriculture, the creation of a new technical personnel, the carrying on of struggles against bourgeois engineer sabotage, etc., and it constitutes one of the very greatest tasks of the revolution. The significance of the S. L of N. A. The programmatic defects of the S. L of N. A. were basic factors in preventing its growth into a mass organization which could play a permanent role in the class struggle. These defects all tended in the direction of narrowing down the League's field of operations, of isolating it from the masses, of condemning it to the sectarianism that afflicted the left wing generally at the time. A major factor in the defeat of the S. L of N. A. and its final liquidation was its inability to recruit a sufficient group of militants because of their obsession with the dual union theory. As I have already indicated, during the S. L of N. A. period, the I.W. was on the upswing and it was hypnotizing the whole left wing, including the militant elements in the Socialist Party, with the glitter of its sparkling industrial union utopia. At that time a big struggle of the left wing was developing in the Socialist Party. The fight, which was a continuation and intensification of our fight of 1909 in the S.P., was led by Bill Haywood and the International Socialist Review Group. It climaxed around the two syndicalist issues of dual industrial unionism and sabotage. On both issues the left wing was defeated. On the question of industrial unionism, the S.P. Convention of 1912, controlled by preachers and lawyers, adopted a typical opportunist resolution. It endorsed industrial unionism in principle but did not explain how to secure it, whether by transforming the old unions or by building a new union movement. Thus the party was left without a policy, which meant that the lefts would go on with their usual dual unionism and the rights with their opportunist vote catching and job hunting in the A.F. of L. On the question of sabotage, the lefts were badly beaten. Haywood was forced out of the National Executive Committee, and the advocacy of sabotage was prohibited on pain of expulsion by a change in the party constitution. This historic defeat of the left wing resulted in a major exodus from the party and an intensification of dual unionism. Led by Haywood himself, thousands quit the party. The great bulk of these militants, heavily syndicalist in ideology, went to the I.W., either as members or sympathizers. They passed by the S. L. of N. A. with nothing but contempt for its boring from within, which they looked upon, its notorious, Article 2, Section 6, read, "Any member of the party who opposes political action or advocates crime, sabotage or other methods of violence as a weapon of the working class to aid in emancipation shall be expelled from membership in the party as the grossest opportunism and a betrayal of the working class. They, however, were not especially repelled by the League's sectarianism, since they and the I.W. which they joined were even more afflicted with the traditional American left-wing sickness. The whole trend of the left wing of the period was against the S.L. of N.A. and its program. Despite its short life, the S.L. of N.A. left its mark upon the left wing, however, and it must occupy an important position in American revolutionary history. It stands as the first organized effort of revolutionary workers to wrest the leadership of the trade unions away from their reactionary leaders. In this it represented a great step forward over the crude dual unionism to which the left wing was then wed dead. The only earlier serious efforts by revolutionaries to win leadership in the trade unions was that of Spies, et al., in 1886, and by the revolutionary pioneers in the early days of the S.L.P., but this was in the period before the left wing became afflicted with its long sickness of dual industrial unionism. The League led the first serious assault upon this paralyzing policy. The S.L. of N.A. also deserves its place in labor history because its boring from within policy constituted a conscious fight against the general besetting sin of the American left wing, sectarianism. Marx and Engels long ago noted this American weakness, from which the left wing, even until the time I write this, 1936, is still struggling to free itself. The League, by seeking to bring the militant workers out of their isolation and into the mass trade unions, struck at the very heart of this destructive disease of sectarianism. It is true that the S.L. of N.A. failed to overcome its general syndicalist outlook, which it had inherited from the I.W. and the left wing of the S.P., but it nevertheless contained in its program of penetrating the old unions the germ of a correct revolutionary policy, a policy which, as we shall see later, eventually has come to the widest adoption by revolutionary workers in the United States, and which is in line with world labor experience. Chapter V. The International Trade Union, Educational League, the failure of the S.L. of N.A. to establish itself permanently in the labor movement was a facer to our small group of syndicalists. It did not, however, shake our faith in the correctness of the policy of boring from within. So, hardly had the S.L. of N.A. collapsed than we began to move to organize a new national organization. This effort crystallized in a conference held in St. Louis, January 17, 1915, consisting of a dozen delegates from Chicago, St. Louis, Omaha and Kansas City. At this conference was set up the International Trade Union Educational League. Chicago was chosen as national headquarters. A small national board, with representatives from our four main points, was selected, and I was picked as secretary. The organizational structure and boring from within policy of the I.T.U.E.L. followed the general lines of the old S.L. of N.A. The national board was only advisory, the local groups deciding upon their own structure and policies. There was no national dues system, a provision chiefly to protect the League from charges of dual unionism. The syndicalist principle of decentralization and autonomy ran all through the League. The I.T.U.E.L. was to extend its organization into Canada. At this time the old S.L. of N.A. papers, Omaha Unionist and San Diego International, were still surviving. But it was decided to launch a new national organ in Chicago. Event to ally this was done in the shape of the Chicago Labor News, edited by Max DeZettel, formerly a leader of the Kansas City S.L. of N.A. As its program, the conference gave temporary endorsement to the old S.L. of N.A. pamphlet, Syndicalism. But our opinions had recently undergone radical changes, and I was instructed to incorporate our new ideas in another document, which I eventually did in a booklet entitled Trade Unionism: The Road to Freedom. This was the only formal statement of policy ever issued by the I.T.U.E.L. The program of the I.T.U.E.L., although basically syndicalist, the I.T.U.E.L. program, as expressed by my pamphlet, had significance because of its wide deviations from orthodox syndicalist theory, the beginnings of which deviations were to be found in the S.L. of N.A. program. The most significant of these new conceptions was the far less stress the I.T.U.E.L. laid upon the importance of class consciousness among the workers. We took the position that the trade union movement, whether animated by a revolutionary theory or not, is by its very nature driven on to the revolutionary goal. We held that in all trade union movements, conservative as well as radical, there is going on a double-phased process of strengthening their forces and increasing their demands accordingly, and that this process of building constantly greater power and making bigger demands inevitably pushes the unions on, willy-nilly, to the overthrow of capitalism. This was indeed faring far afield from the narrow leftist sectarianism of the IWW, and it constituted a sag into right opportunism. I was responsible for this theory and based my conclusions primarily upon the lessons of the great British strikes of transport workers, railroaders and miners in 1910-11. But we saw the same process at work in the American labor movement, although at a slower tempo. My pamphlet thus explains the first principle of my theory, that is, the spontaneous development by the trade unions of sufficient power to overthrow capitalism. 4.5 years ago, the gigantic Federation of Transport Workers pulled its scattered forces together and declared a general strike throughout Great Britain. This monster strike set all British capitalism a tremble. The Shipping Federation, strongest employers' association in the world and for many years absolute dictator of English maritime affairs, crumbled in 2 days' time from the attack of the labor giant. Even the British government itself was panic-stricken. A profound fear seized the ruling class. This fear turned to consternation when the railroad men joined the general walkout. Something had to be done, and that at once, unless the rapidly awakening workers were to take charge of the situation entirely. So the railroad men were speedily placated, and, a little later, the transport workers were sent back to work with one of the greatest victories ever won by labor anywhere in the world. These big strikes were hardly over when Great Britain was stricken by one still more terrific. This was the nationwide walkout of the 1 million coal miners. So paralyzed was British society by this immense strike that it was truthfully said that England had never been in such a critical situation since the days of the Spanish Armada. The strike ended by the proud British government being compelled to do the bidding of the coal miners' union. But even these society-shaking movements do not by any means exhaust the possibilities of trade unionism. Since the war began, the British transport workers, railroaders, and miners' federations have combined themselves into one gigantic offensive and defensive alliance. This great body, numbering over 1,500,000 workers, is already famous as the Triple Alliance. Now the question arises, if the three federations in the Triple Alliance, striking singly, could bring terror to the heart of capitalism and prove themselves a match for the government, what will happen when all three strike together? The probability is that when the Triple Alliance strikes, and it is only awaiting a favorable opportunity to do so, it will prove itself the strongest element in British society. The trade unions will at last have the upper hand. But if such should not be the case, far greater combinations than even this monster are latent in the working class and only awaiting development. Thus, by a process native to all trade unions, the latter would go on building up greater and greater labor combinations and strikes until finally they would find themselves dominant in society by virtue of their ever-expanding and invincible power. And then, here is the second principle of the ITUEL theory. Once they felt themselves masters of the situation in a general strike, they would inevitably proceed to expropriate the capitalists and take command of society. They would do this, even though their general strike demands had been originally only of a minor nature, because, I argued, the basic policy of trade unions, whether radical or conservative in outlook, is always to make demands according to their strength, increasing these demands as their strength grows. My pamphlet explains. The truth is that the trade union movement acts always upon the revolutionary policy of utilizing its power to the utmost in forcing the employer to grant it concessions. Its method is to take all it can, and it often overreaches itself, as many lost strikes eloquently testify. It is idle to say that the trade unions will rest content with anything short of complete emancipation. For they are as insatiable as the veriest so-called revolutionary unions. In the measure their strength increases, so do their demands. They have sent wages up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, $8 per day, and hours down 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 per day with all kinds of other concessions sandwiched in between. And now they are more radical in their demands than ever before in their history. Permanently satisfied trade unions under capitalism would be the eighth wonder of the world, outrivaling in interest the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They would be impossible. With its growing power, organized labor will go on winning greater and greater concessions regardless of how profound they may be. It is purest assumption to state that the trade unions would balk at the overthrow of the wages system. All this constituted a theory of the spontaneously revolutionary character of trade unionism as such, regardless of its expressed conservative ideology. Consequently, we discounted such conservative AFL slogans as a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and the interests of capital and labor are identical, as being only so much protective camouflage designed to obscure the basically revolutionary tendencies of the movement. According to the ITUEL L. The task of the militant minority was not to make the trade unions revolutionary through educational work. The most it could do was to hasten their natural revolutionary development. As I stated this same theory 4 years later in my book, The Great Steel Strike and Its Lessons, page 259. The trade unions will not become anti-capitalist through the conversion of their members to a certain point of view or by the adoption of certain preambles. They are that by their very makeup and methods. The most that can be done is to clarify their aims and intensify their efforts towards freedom. Logically, from this argumentation, I concluded that the main revolutionary task was the building of mass trade unions. All else was subordinate to that. The question of revolutionary propaganda was a secondary matter. With developing mass organization, the workers would proceed more or less spontaneously to the revolution. Of course, they would make many mistakes and many times they would be betrayed by conservative leaders, but the basic trends of the trade union movement, A. To build up greater and finally irresistible combinations of unions and strikes and B. Take from the bosses all they had the power to take, would surely carry even conservative workers on to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism in spite of all obstacles. The errors of the I.T.U.E.L. program. This theory of the I.T.U.E.L. is subject to the same general criticism made of syndicalism in previous chapters. It had in it, likewise, traces of Bernsteinism, which erroneously concludes that trade unions can permanently improve the workers' conditions under capitalism, a theory that has been thoroughly exploded by the recent decline of the workers' living standards in all capitalist countries. But its basic weakness was the characteristic syndicalist oversimplification of the revolutionary problem, by assuming that the overthrow of capitalism could be brought about by trade union action alone. And it worsened this oversimplification by minimizing the necessity of revolutionary class consciousness, of revolutionary theory. The I.T.U.E.L. theory of an automatic trade union revolution, like syndicalism in general, grossly underestimates the violence of the resistance made by the capitalist class. Its perspective of a more or less peaceful revolutionary general strike has no basis in reality. The experience of the whole post-war period of capitalism, the many revolutionary struggles, the rise of fascism, etc., has demonstrated clearly, as Marx pointed out long ago, that the capitalist class will fight desperately with its state power and otherwise against the rising revolutionary proletariat and its allies, and that it can be defeated only by the superior might of the revolutionary masses. The I.T.U.E.L. also failed to make the vital distinction between the native class instinct which enables undeveloped workers to carry on a trade union struggle for concessions to lessen the rigors of capitalism, and the cultivated class consciousness which is necessary to dispel the many capitalist illusions obsessing the workers and to lead them along the revolutionary path to overthrow capitalism. This clear class consciousness is especially indispensable for the organized revolutionary vanguard of the workers upon whom falls the task of leading the less developed masses to the revolution and without whom the masses become hopelessly lost in the capitalist jungle. Lenin, in his fight against the Russian economists, at the turn of the century, although he then knew nothing of this, clearly pointed out the dangers of underestimating revolutionary consciousness. He declared that without revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement. He showed the inability of trade unions as such to break through the capitalist encirclement. He said, the spontaneous labor movement is able by itself to create, and inevitably will create, only trade unions and working-class trade union politics, or precisely class bourgeois politics. Lenin also demonstrated that the underestimation of revolutionary understanding sets up a bar to the revolution when he declared the belittling of the role of the conscious element of the what is to be done role of the social democracy, written before the party split. W.Z.F. means, whether one likes it or not, growth of bourgeois ideology among the workers, and the experience of the Russian and other revolutions has amply confirmed Lenin's analysis by showing the indispensable revolutionary role of the conscious proletarian vanguard organized in the Communist Party. The I.T.U.E.L. theory also underestimated the counter-revolutionary role of the reactionary trade union and social East Party bureaucracy. The theory, while it recognized the strike-breaking effects of these bureaucrats, believed that they would be unable to halt the elemental move forward of the trade unions. The error of such a conclusion has been since exemplified in many countries, notably in Germany in 1918, when the reactionary socialist labor leaders, because of their organizational and ideological grip upon the masses of workers, were able to defeat the revolution even where the armed forces of capitalism had failed to do so. Life eventually explodes false theories, and it seemed to take particular pains to wreck that of the I.T.U.E.L., and under my very eyes. As I have stated, it was around the Triple Alliance of transport workers, miners and railroaders in Great Britain that we developed our theory of spontaneous trade union revolution. Well, to run ahead of our story a bit, it fell to my lot to be in London in 1921 when the Triple Alliance, upon which I had placed so many hopes, faced its great strike test. The post-war crisis was on, with the bosses slashing the workers' wages. The coal miners had struck all over the country, and they called upon their affiliated transport and railroad workers to strike with them. It was the great movement long looked forward to by syndical ISDS. The huge Triple Alliance was about to deliver its crushing blow. But the capitalists did not spend their time bemoaning their fate. On the contrary, they got busy through their labor lackeys, the McDonalds, Kleins, Hodges, Thomas, et al., and had them betray the workers' struggle. These Ibid leaders managed to prevent the railroaders and transport workers from striking. The miners were thus left to their fate, and British labor had its Black Friday. The results were that the Triple Alliance collapsed completely and was soon dissolved, and the workers suffered one of the greatest defeats in their history. Then, as if to make still clearer the futility of the I.T.U.E.L. syndicalist theory, life also proceeded to smash those gigantic combinations of conservative trade unions, which we foresaw in the event that the Triple Alliance was unable to put an end to capitalism by its general strike. Thus, the Great British General Strike of 1926, which counted 4 million workers. Surely, if there was anything to our theory that conservative trade unions, striking for partial demands, would smash capitalism, now was the supreme opportunity for it to demonstrate itself. But the capitalists disposed of this great trade union strike without too much difficulty. Although they had mobilized their armed forces to apply violence against the strikers, they did not have to use them. Once again, their labor lieutenants, the reformist trade union and Labor Party leaders, did the strike-breaking job successfully. They used every means to prevent the workers developing the strike into a real fight, and, finally, they called the strike off altogether. Result: another disaster, even more far-reaching than that of Black Friday in 1921. Manifestly, what was needed to win the British Triple Alliance and general strikes was a strong Communist Party and mass trade union opposition able to wrest the leadership of the struggles from the control of the Labour Party misleaders and to develop them into a real political struggle. But the British C.P. and minority movement were too weak to do this. Altogether, both situations were graphic illustrations of the futility of overestimating the role of conservative trade unionism in the class struggle, of neglecting the fundamental role of revolutionary consciousness and of the organized revolutionary vanguard of the workers, which is the Communist Party. In order to criticize the I.T.U.E.L. theory of a spontaneous trade union revolution, I have somewhat anticipated my narrative. Of course, in the days of the I.T.U.E.L., I was quite unaware of this analysis of our program and the disastrous British experiences contained above. To us, let me repeat, the big thing was to build the trade unions. Then, with a constantly developing organization and even greater demands, the workers would more or less automatically, even without revolutionary theory, proceed to overthrow capitalism. All that the militant minority could do was to hasten this basic revolutionary trend of trade unionism. This erroneous conception, an enormous exaggeration of the role of conservative trade unionism, dominated my activities for the next several years. As we shall see, it led me, on the one hand, to perform some of the most effective organizing work I have ever done and, on the other hand, to make one of the greatest political mistakes in my life. The work of the I.T.U.E.L. The I.T.U.E.L. was born a few months after the beginning of the World War, in the midst of the 1914-15 industrial crisis and just on the eve of the Great War boom. It was a time of rapidly rising cost of living and of spreading discontent among the workers. The workers were in a militant mood, but their organizations were giving them no fighting lead and there were few struggles. The A.F.L. unions were stagnant in the industrial crisis. The I.W.W. had declined after its upshoot of 2 years before, and the S.P. was still suffering heavily from the big split of 1912. Objectively, the situation was favorable for I.T.U.E.L. work, which translated itself chiefly into efforts to organize the unorganized. But the I.T.U.E.L. never succeeded in developing into a national movement. I made a 7,000-mile agitation tour through the West, hoboing it in wintertime as usual, trying to build the movement. Here and there local militants endeavored to set up groups, but without avail. The I.T.U.E.L. secured less spread nationally even than had the S.L. of N.A. It finally simmered itself down pretty much into a local league in Chicago, a group, however, which was fated to play an important role in the general labor movement. The reasons for the failure of the I.T.U.E.L. to grow were pretty much the same as in the case of the S.L. of N.A. There were the usual syndicalist weaknesses. Then there was the traditional left-wing opposition to boring from within. Although the I.W.W. was in a slump, dual unionism remained the unchallengeable and undiscussable gospel of the I.W.W., the S.L.P., and the left wing of the S.P. The dual union theory was at the time drawing sustenance from resentment against the deepening corruption in the A.F.L. and its impotence in trustified industry, as well as from the growth of the amalgamated clothing workers and independent unions split off from the United Garment Workers. Another factor that drove a wedge between the I.T.U.E.L. and the body of the left-wing forces was the right opportunist conception of syndicalism that we had developed. This clashed violently with the leftist, sectarian conceptions previous generally in the left wing intended to further isolate our forces from the general revolutionary movement. The Chicago League, the Chicago group of the I.T.U.E.L., was noteworthy because it was instrumental in setting on foot many militant movements, and it was a prime factor in eventually making the Chicago Federation of Labor the most progressive labor council in the United States, through its initiative in starting the Great Stockyards and Steel Industry campaigns of 1917 to 19, activity in the Labor Party movement, support of the Mooney Billings case, etc. It was not a large group in I.T.U.E.L. days. Probably all those who might be classed loosely as members did not exceed 100. But its members were very militant and influential, including Jack Johnston, Joe Mann Lay, Max DeZettel, J. A. Jones, Ed W. Rice, etc. It had its main basis in the painters, railway carmen, carpenters, machinists, barbers, retail clerks, tailors, ladies' garment workers, metal polishers and iron molders. Many of its members were local union officials. As for myself, in the latter part of 1915, while working in Swift's car shops in the Stockyards, I was elected business agent, or more properly, organizer of the Chicago District Council of the Railway Carmen, by a referendum vote of the 13 affiliated locals, a job at which I gained much valuable experience as an organizer. Through 1915 and 1916 we were building up a strong I.T.U.E.L. delegation in the Chicago Federation of Labor. Our policy was to make a sort of informal united front on many questions with the Fitzpatrick leading group. Although we considered John Fitzpatrick quite innocent of any theoretical knowledge of the class struggle, we sized him up as an honest and courageous man who made the best fight he knew how for the workers. A few years earlier the progressive, Fitzpatrick-Nockels-Dold faction had beaten the notorious, skinny, Madden building trades gang of crooks and won the control of the Federation away from them. This fight, followed up by Fitzpatrick's support of the bitterly fought, outlaw, Chicago printing trades strike and of the earlier fierce struggle of the garment workers which gave birth to the amalgamated clothing workers, had brought the Fitzpatrick leadership into sharp conflict with the Gompers National machine, with the result that the C.F.L. lost its charter a couple of times. This fight against Gompers suited us and we were for pushing it on all fronts. We also endorsed Fitzpatrick's desultory war upon the S.P. and favored sharpening this, too. We drew a line, however, against Fitzpatrick's politics, which were the characteristic A.F.L. nonpartisan support of Friends of Labor on the two old party tickets. We were against all such political activity, pinning our entire hope on economic struggle. The I.T.U.E.L. Chicago group took an energetic part in all the local strikes of the period, making it a special point to work with the educational or sabotage committees of the locals involved. We came into sharp collision with the growing gangster control of the unions, making bitter enemies of the Murphy and O'Donnell gangs and other forerunners of the lurid Al Capone era. The I.T.U.E.L. also branched out nationally with its agitation. We sent many articles to the trade union journals embodying our viewpoint, and we circularized thousands of local unions, pushing a distribution of our pamphlet, Trade Unionism, The Road to Freedom. A very important action of the Chicago I.T.U.E.L. was to secure the adoption by the C.F.L. of a proposal to form a Chicago Railroad Council, to be made up of locals of all railroad unions. The heads of the railroad craft unions fought this as a dangerous rank and file movement. Gradu ally, however, long after the I.T.U.E.L. had died, the movement took root especially among the shop crafts until in 1919 when, under the leadership of L. M. Hoover, with whom we had worked closely since the days of the I.C. strike in 1911, it waged the outlaw shopmen's national strike of 200,000 workers. During 1916, the S.P. put out a national 8-hour bill. This our Chicago group fought tooth and nail, advocating instead a general strike to win the 8-hour day. We were defeated on this in the C.F.L. John Fitzpatrick supporting the 8-hour bill. He had small faith in the strike as a weapon, and I remember what fine scorn he poured out upon our direct action arguments. What chance is there, for example, he said, for the poverty-stricken, oppressed, trust-ridden and demoralized packing house workers to get the eighth or day any other way than through legislation? Yet, curiously enough, it was only a couple of years later when Fitzpatrick and I, standing at the head of a great national movement of 200,000 packing house workers, helped establish the 8-hour day by trade union action, not only for Chicago, but throughout the whole packing industry of the United States. The Chicago group eventually developed a split over the question of working with Fitzpatrick. Dezettel, editor of our Labor News, after legally entrenching his control of the paper, gradually began to make alliances with the corrupt officials of the building trades, flat janitors, moving picture operators, etc., and increasingly he took a stand against Fitzpatrick. Consequently, this course of his developed a break between Dezettel and us. The Labor News later continued to drift to the right and into deep corruption. By the time the United States entered the war, it had degenerated into a typical patriotic, anti-red, gompersite grafting labor sheet. Dezettel made stacks of money, even boasting that he cleared $50,000 in the year before he died. Every morning, for his personal expenses of the day, he would write himself a check for $100. He was finally killed, after a night of debauch, during an accident in a scab, yellow taxi. His paper lingered on for several years, a parasite on the workers. Objective conditions were against the establishment of the I.T.U.E.L. on a mass basis. Its own policies were a defective and the left wing generally was still thoroughly saturated with dual unionism. The loss of the Chicago Labor News, which we had hoped to develop into an instrument that would entrench us nationally in the labor movement, was the last straw for the I.T.U.E.L. The decay of our organization was hastened, so that by the spring of 1917 the Chicago group dropped the name of the I.T.U.E.L. and consisted thereafter simply of a scattering of influential militants meeting each other only occasionally in the course of their work in the unions. The I.T.U.E.L. as a formal organization perished after 2.5 years of life and followed its predecessor, the S.L. of N.A. into history, although its erstwhile members were soon to play a big role in Chicago. Thus ended the second episode in our long struggle to establish a boring from within policy for the American Revolutionary Movement. Chapter 8. The A.F. of L. The Meat Packing Campaign. The World War. For the first 2.5 years of the World War, the American capitalist class was in the highly favorable position of seeing its international rivals gradually destroying each other, while it sold them the necessary ammunition, captured their markets and leapt ahead to a position as leading imperialist power of the world. About the beginning of 1917, however, the danger appeared that Germany might win the war. This would never do, for the United States, besides fearing the loss of its war loans, needed the crushing of the rapidly rising German imperialist power almost as urgently as England did. So, President Wilson, casting aside as junk his pacifist election slogans, was skillful enough to find war pretexts, and on April 6, 1917, the United States entered the slaughter. The great masses of workers were not in favor of the war. This was manifest by their overwhelming refusal to volunteer, which forced the government almost immediately to apply the compulsory draft. Naturally, the A.F. of L leaders, as faithful labor lieutenants of capital, were not slow to leap in as recruiting agencies for the government. Even before the war, on March 12, 1917, they already assured Wilson of their support, by their statement that the trade unions hereby pledge ourselves in peace or in war, in stress or in storm, to stand unreservedly by the standard of liberty and the safety and preservation of the institutions and ideals of our people. Then, as the war developed, these leaders entered solidly into the war activities on every field, except the battlefield. They also bound themselves not to conduct strikes and not to organize the workers in the open shop industries. 86. In general, the revolutionary movement adopted a stand against the United States' entry into the war, although its opposition took largely the form of pacifism. The S.P., under the pressure of its left wing, adopted an anti-war resolution. But the American opportunist socialist leaders, like their brothers in Europe, were pro-war. While such fighters as Debs and Ruthenberg were going to jail for anti-war activities, Ty Hillquits, O'Neills, etc., were busy sabotaging the party's ITI war policy, and another big group of them, the Wally, G.S., Spargos, Russells, etc., quit the party altogether and joined up with Wilson's and Gomper's pro-war campaign. Th. Best fight against the war was made by the I.W. Under Bill Haywood's leadership, the I.W., growing swiftly, conducted an aggressive strike policy in various industries, and only its lack of forces prevented its calling a general strike against the war. Its militants suffered the severest wartime persecutions of any organization. As for my own attitude, I was, of course, opposed to the World War and also to the United States' participation therein. Both the S. L. of N. A. and the I. T. U. E. L. had condemned capitalist war in general and the World War in particular. We made the syndicalist argument that if the European workers had met the declaration of war by calling a general strike, the war could have been stopped. We correctly charged that the opportunist leaders of the Socialist Second International, affiliated in sympathy and interests to the bourgeoisie of their respective countries, were the ones responsible for breaking down the workers' resistance to the war and for leading them to be massacred for the capitalists' profit. At the time the U.S. entered the war, one belonged to no organization, except my union, the Railway Carmen. The I.T.U.E.L. had already disintegrated, and as for the I.W.W. and the left wing of the S.P., I was quite out of contact with them in their anti-war activities, because I had been at loggerheads with them both for several years past over the questions of political action and boring from within. Moreover, I had quite a different viewpoint about the war situation and the main tasks confronting the revolutionary movement. My views may be summarized as follows. I was convinced that capitalism was shooting itself to pieces in the war. I felt sure that it was so weakening itself that it would be overtaken by the proletarian revolution either before the war's end or shortly afterward. I greeted the Russian Revolution of March 1917, and later that of November entire same year, as the beginning of the end of capitalism. But I doubted if Russia was industrial enough for its revolution to lead directly to socialism, so I looked rather to die more industrialized countries, especially Germany and England, for lead. What organization would bring about the revolution in Europe? I was positive the Socialist Party would not do so, nor was I mistaken in that. I took my viewpoint from the old I.T.U.E.L. theory to which I still firmly adhered, and looked to the trade unions as the revolutionary force. Thus, the trade unions would carry through the overthrow of capitalism, even though they were not expressly revolutionary in their philosophy. In all the industrial countries, including the United States, the unions were at the time growing very rapidly, and they soon reached by far the highest point in their history. I was certain that the day was not distant when the swiftly expanding labor unions would become so powerful that they would push over the tottering capitalist structure and take charge of society. With such a conception, I logically arrived at the conclusion that the main revolutionary task in the war period was the building of trade unionism, the organization of the millions of unorganized. Everything else was to be subordinated and sacrificed for the accomplishment of this central objective. At all costs the unions, the eventual destroyers of capitalism, must be built, and my plan to do this was by taking the fullest advantage of the great wartime demand for labor power to recruit the unions through organization campaigns and strikes. Land, Germany, France, etc. The workers would construct of their unions a great revolutionary weapon which, with ever-growing power and demands, they would surely use to smash capitalism. To me the pacifist outcry to end the war seemed insufficient and futile. The main thing that had to be done was to utilize militantly the war situation to create the only force that could finish off capitalism, the trade unions. And, according to the I.T.U.E.L's wrong conception of the role of class consciousness in the struggle, it would suffice for eventual revolution even if these unions were of the so-called conservative type. In the United States, mass unions in the great unorganized industries could only be built by struggle, notwithstanding the tolerance of the Wilson government towards trade unionism. Such a strike-struggle policy was antagonistic to the government's effective carrying on of the war, and I so understood it. During the war it turned out, as we shall see, that I eventually headed major organization campaigns and strikes in the two key war industries, meatpacking, where the slogan was, "Food will win the war," and in steel, the heart of all the munitions industries. And in both of them, notwithstanding constant menaces from these powerful trusts and the government and of betrayals by reactionary labor leaders, I carried through, as best I could, the above policy of active organization, based on militant strikes in defense of the workers' demands and in opposition to the government's war interests. Despite the revolutionary aims I had in mind, this whole wartime policy of mine was grossly incorrect. True, it had in it definite elements of antagonism to the war, and it was also in sharp conflict with the Gomper's social peace policy of no strikes and no organization campaigns, a program that certainly prevented the organization of several million workers during the war period. Nevertheless, it was fundamentally wrong. What was wrong with my policy originated in my syndicalist overestimation of the role of simple trade unionism in the class struggle. It sacrificed too much for the build of trade unions. It ignored the fundamental necessity that all working-class activities of the time had to center around direct agitation and militant political fight against the war. Building the unions and carrying on militant strikes, of course, were necessarily a basic requirement for an effective struggle against the war, but only on condition that this work was a definite part of the broader political struggle designed, as Lenin clearly showed, to transform the imperialist war into a revolutionary war against capitalism. But my policy of concentrating all attention upon simply building trade unions, in the hope of their eventually carrying through the revolution, involved actually, in spite of my good intent an opportunist compromise with the war. And any such compromise inevitably played into the hands of the capitalist warmakers. Beginning the packing house campaign. It was one thing, however, for me to have a theory that the wartime presented a big opportunity and imperative need to organize the workers, and quite a different matter to put this theory into practice. I was not so naive as to think that the A.F. of L bureaucrats would organize the masses. So what was to be done? When the United States entered the war, one was working as a car inspector on the Sioux Line in Chicago, for at the expiration of my year's term as business agent of the railway. Carmen, some time previous, I had refused the unanimous nomination of our 13 locals for a second term and had gone back to work on the road. While I inspected freight cars, I puzzled over what I might do to get some real organization work started. I felt quite helpless, I must say. RITUEL was gone and there was I working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and, consequent upon these long hours of work, unable even to attend the meetings of the Chicago Federation of Labor, of which I was a delegate. Finally, however, one day as I was walking to work, and I remember well that it was July 11, 1917, it struck me suddenly that perhaps I could get a campaign started to organize the workers in the great Chicago packing houses, whom the A.F. of L had grossly neglected during many years. Except for the Teamsters, they were then totally unorganized, their conditions were frightful, and the demand for workers was strong, a splendid opportunity for an organizing campaign. Perhaps the progressive C.F. of L could be induced to give its support. No sooner thought than done. That very night I took the matter up with the Chicago District Council of the Railway. Carmen, which was controlled by former I.T.U.E.L. militants. Our craft is a prominent one in the packing house situation, because the refrigerator car, which we build, is the basis of that industry, so the council readily endorsed my proposal. On the 13th, I was one of our committee to the meeting of the half-dead Local 87 of the bankrupt butcher workmen. We secured its reluctant endorsement, and on the 15th the two unions introduced a resolution into the Chicago Federation of Labor calling for a joint organization campaign of all trades in the local packing industry. The C.F. of L unanimously adopted our resolution. Thus, only 4 days after the plan was born, the campaign to organize the slaves of the Great Packing Trust had got underway. On July 23, we formed the Stockyards Labor Council of a dozen local unions with jurisdiction over packing house workers, including butcher workmen, railway carmen, machinists, electricians, coopers, carpenters, office workers, steam fitters, engineers, firemen, etc. I was elected secretary and Martin Murphy, a rank and FDE butcher, president. Our working plan was that of a federation. We rejected the traditional left-wing policy of launching a new, one big industrial union, as such a dual union would have split our forces and wrecked our movement at the outset. We decided to move towards industrial unionism by setting up an industrial federation and by locking the various component craft unions so firmly together under one council, one executive board, one set of business agents, etc., as to create a firm front in the whole industry. The workers accepted this industrial plan readily, as their big 1904 strike had been completely smashed because of disunity and union scabbing among the several craft unions organized in the two separate, jangling councils. We infused our whole movement with the spirit of industrial unionism. At the first meeting of the Stockyards Labor Council, we decided to base our movement primarily upon the unskilled masses, that is, the foreign-born and Negroes, who made up a majority of the workers. The Negroes, of whom there were 12,000 among the 60,000 Chicago packing house workers, presented a thorny problem. Many of the skilled crafts, despite our best efforts, barred them, although the main union, the butcher workmen, admitted them. To complicate matters, we faced the open hostility of the Negro intelligentsia, embittered by A.F. of L discrimination. When we began our organization work, we proceeded upon the policy of taking the Negroes into the big mass butcher workmen local unions, and we thought that we had thereby solved the problem. But at once the Negro race leaders raised a shout that we were placing the Negroes into white unions. Here they would be a helpless minority, and they demanded separate Negro unions. We naively agreed to this demand, whereupon, almost overnight, the cry of Jim Crow went along State Street with devastating effect. We eventually found a solution, however, by adopting the neighborhood principle, that is, by building mass unions in both Negro and white districts and having them open alike to Negroes and whites. This killed the Jim Crow issue and forced the corrupt LA Ments among the Negro intelligentsia, agents of the Packers, to come out openly against our organizing campaign Jenner ally and to advocate a policy of scabbing. Such a proposal was, in the Butcher Workman, November 1919, Dennis Lane, reactionary head of the Butcher Workmen's Union, declared. The self-elected parties, mean Ingus, W. Z. F. also took it upon themselves, without consulting any of the international unions affected, to draft a set of laws to govern the stockyard workers, laws which would render the laws of the affected international unions null and void, also their craft scabbing, W. Z. F. so far as their stockyard workers are concerned. Easy for us to beat, however, and the sequel showed that we finally won over the majority of the Negroes and built up the largest Negro trade union membership ever organized in any American city. But let me come back to the sequence of my story. Where were we to get organizers and money for our campaign? The A.F. of L National Office gave us not a penny, and its local general organizer, Flood, was cynical and contemptuous. The ultra-reactionary Butcher Workman officials, with a moribund union, looked upon us as upstarts and dangerous rivals, and extended us nothing but hostility. The preliminary work was done mostly on a voluntary basis by J. W. John Stone, myself, and other former I.T.U.E.L. militants. The C.F. of L was friendly, but its initial financial help consisted in paying only the expenses of our first mass meeting. Upon the recommendation of the C.F. of L and Railway Carmen's District Council, however, I was most reluctantly appointed by the B.R. C. of A. General President, Ryan, as an organizer for a 90-day period. After we got well started and our movement looked promising, the C.F. of L also put on Jack Johnston as a paid organizer. Eventually, the Illinois Federation of Labor also gave us a couple of Negro organizers, and we scared up the help of occasional butcher workmen and other craft union business agents. Beyond which, the movement financed itself and produced its own organizers. John Fitzpatrick, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor, from the first was sympathetic to our campaign, but he was skeptical of its outcome, he being afflicted with the prevailing pessimism in trade union circles to the effect that the packing house workers were unorganizable. But as our campaign began to get results, he took a more active part, eventually becoming chairman of our national movement. His services were especially valuable in combating the dis. This finished for me 10 years as a railroad worker, with service on many roads, S. P. N. P. S. A. L. C. N. W. O. R. and N. P. and R. S. P. and S. Sioux, etc., and in many capacities: fireman, brakeman, car repairer, air brakeman, car inspector, freight handler, railroad construction teamster, shop laborer, camp cook, etc., in all corners of the country. Ruptive tactics of reactionary A.F. of L leaders and in carrying on the negotiations with the Packers and the government. An aggressive campaign. We launched our organization drive with great vigor and directed our efforts at the 5 great Chicago plants of the biggest packers of the huge beef trust. The workers came in large numbers to our meetings to listen, but, suspicious from long years of A.F. of L betrayal and incompetence, few joined the unions. At the end of 6 weeks of intensive work, we had organized only 500 members. Fitzpatrick pronounced this result excellent, as no such showing had been made since the fatal strike of 13 years before. But to me our progress was wholly unsatisfactory. The great packing industry could never be organized by such a one-by-one method. We simply had to find a way to start the workers into the unions en masse. Our little militant leading group was determined that at all costs the workers must be organized, and we were prepared to use drastic methods to this end. We were proceeding on a militant strike policy which had nothing in common with the Gompers' wartime, no strike program, and we were convinced that the workers were strike-minded and would respond to our efforts if they saw a prospect for strike action in support of the demands, 8-hour day, right to organize, etc., that we were popularizing. Hence I proposed to our small leading committee a detailed plan whereby our 500 members, after good preparation and with the organized assistance of other industry militants, could be used to strike the great mass of 60,000 workers. It was a very risky move, but I am still convinced it would have succeeded had we tried it. The organizers agreed with my proposals, but, as we were getting ready, fortunately we were able to find a surer way to bring the masses into action by a strike movement. It was so, under the influence of our Chicago campaign and the generally favorable situation, local organizations and strikes had begun to take shape in various Western packing centers. I, therefore, proposed the strategy of calling a national conference of packing house workers to prepare demands to be made upon the packers. The leaders of the butcher workmen, typical A.F. of L. reactionaries, smelling the possible strike, strongly disagreed with this proposal, even as they violently condemned our whole militant line. But fearing to be swept aside by the rising mass movement, they finally grudgingly agreed. Whereupon, over their protests, we gave the story to the newspapers, stating that the move for a conference would probably culminate in a big national packing house strike. In wartime, with the U.S. government straining every nerve to supply the hungry millions of the Allies with food, this was big news. So next day, as I expected, the Chicago press bore great flaming headlines, "Strike looms at yards." And so it was in other packing centers. The whole packing industry seethed over the threatening strike. The effect upon the discontented mass of workers was electrical. At last they saw the action they wanted, a chance to strike back at their exploiters. Then they fairly broke the doors down in joining the Chicago unions in masses. The feeble stockyards organizations grew wildly. For example, the decrepit Local 87, Butcher Workmen, took in 1,400 members at its first meeting after the press announcement of the threatening strike. Likewise, the movement grew like a bay tree in Sioux City, St. Louis, Fort Worth, Omaha, Kansas City, St. Joseph, St. Paul, Oklahoma City, Denver and other big western packing centers. Tens of thousands streamed in the A.F.L. locals. Our strategy had succeeded better even than we had anticipated. We were over the top in the organization of the great national packing industry, for years considered in trade union circles to be an utterly hopeless task. Meanwhile, we had joined the dozen cooperating packing house unions together nationally into a loose committee, of which John Fitzpatrick was chairman and I secretary. However, the packers had not been idle. At first, except for flooding our movement with spies, they had made no hostile move, evidently believing that our campaign, like so many A.F.L. drives, in the past, would collapse of its own weight. But when they realized we were making real headway, they became alarmed and replied with the usual open-shop weapon of discharging active unionists. This discharge campaign spread far and reached its climax when Libby, McNeil and Libby, a Swift subsidiary, fired some 50 of its Chicago workers. The policy of our militant organizers was to head towards a national strike of packing house workers. We figured that only by such a strike could the workers fully secure their demands and establish their unions. We were also convinced that the packers and the government never could stand a great packing house strike in wartime, in view of the frantic demand for foodstuffs. So the packers' provocations fitted right into our strategy and we replied to Libby, McNeil and Libby by quickly taking a national strike vote, which was almost 100% favorable. Then we began hasty preparation for a strike, but just at this juncture the A.F.L. stepped in and steered the whole movement into the treacherous channels of a government mediation. The government comes to help the packers. The Wilson government, it will be remembered, to sidetrack the many strike movements and to prevent the extension of the trade unions into the open shop industries, had a policy of making government labor agreements for the duration of the war. Its Federal Mediation Commission was going about the country settling strikes on this basis. The A.F.L. leadership was, of course, in full harmony with this anti-union policy. Jack Johnston, myself and other packing house militants were against such government interference. Fitzpatrick also opposed the government's entering, but he had no confidence, these spies were everywhere. For example, 2 of our 3 Polish and Lithuanian organizers in Chicago finally confessed being undercover men in a strike, whereas the whole strategy of Johnston and myself was based on the need for a strike to force the packers by direct pressure to sign a union agreement. But the A.F.L. brought the government in spite of us. It happened like this. As a matter of routine, we formally notified the A.F.L. headquarters of our strike vote, whereupon, without notifying us, they promptly turned the matter over to the government. We were immediately infested with agents of the Federal Mediation Commission. Later, when I protested to Gompers about his bringing the government onto our necks, he lamely excused himself on the ground that he was not in his office when our telegram arrived and that his secretary, Miss Lagarde, had referred it as a matter of course to the Department of Labor for mediation, an explanation which threw a bright light on the A.F.L.'s wartime no-strike policy. This A.F.L. action upset our whole strike strategy. What was now to be done? Could we ignore the government mediators and strike anyhow? The cards were all stacked against such a course. The A.F.L. leaders would be solidly opposed to it and so, likewise, would be the national officials of all the dozen federated unions in our joint movement. The great weakness of our Chicago stockyards Labor Council, from first to last, was that, although it gave the whole stimulus and militant leadership to the national movement, the actual control of the international unions involved remained in the hands of reactionary A.F.L. officials and, alas, we had no organized militant minority to link us up with the rank and file workers in the other packing centers. About 18 months after this, in the 1919 steel campaign, I faced a somewhat similar situation. Our committee then confronted a demand from President Wilson, President Gompers, and a large majority of the leaders of the 24 steel unions that we should sidetrack our developing strike movement and put our trust in government maneuverings. We were strongly organized enough to defy this treacherous demand, however, and to go on with the great national strike. But in the packing house situation, with our new unions and our lack of national control, such a course would have been folly. So, yielding before superior forces, we had to enter, against our will, into the government mediation and to depend upon the growing strength and militancy of our movement to carry it on to victory in spite of its enemies, the packers, the government and the A.F. of L top leadership. The packing industry organized. After much jockeying around, we finally drew up an agreement with the Federal Mediation Commission in Chicago, in December 1917, which provided for the right to organize, set up shop committees, present grievances, attend union conventions, etc. It further granted a 10% wage increase, the principle of seniority in employment, no discrimination because of creed, color or nationality, display of piecework schedules, abolition of arbitrary discharge, abolition of compulsory benefit societies, establishment of proper dressing, lunch and washrooms, etc. Our other 6 major demands then went to Federal Judge S. Altshuler, administrator of the packing industry, for arbitration decision. The National Packing House arbitration proceedings, held in Chicago early in 1918, were highly dramatic. The 5 big packers, Armour, Swift, Morris, Cudahy and Wilson, were represented by attorneys Meyer and Condon, and the workers were represented by Frank P. Walsh and John Fitzpatrick. For 3.5 weeks we paraded witnesses on the stand, workers, economists, labor leaders, including Gompers, giving publicity to the horrible working and live-in conditions of the packing house workers and the fabulous profits being made by the packers, Armour himself admitting a war profit of $40 million in 1917. I must say that I took double pleasure in this exposure and discomfiture of the packers, for I personally had felt the lash of the hard conditions in the industry, having worked the winter of 1915 in the Swift and Company car shops for such miserable wages that I was too poor to buy an overcoat to shield me from the bitterly cold weather. On March 30, 1918, Judge Altshuler handed down his award. With an eye on our militant movement and on the certainty of a national packing house strike in case of an unsatisfactory decision, he granted about 85% of the union's 6 demands. His award provided for another 10% to 25% wage increase, a basic 8-hour day with 10 hours pay, extra time for overtime, equal pay for men and women doing the same class of work, a guarantee of 5 days work per week in slack seasons, and time off with pay for lunch periods in 8-hour shifts. The award was retroactive, the 125,000 workers of the 5 big packers receiving $6 million in back pay, or an average of $40 per worker. With enthusiasm the packing house workers greeted these terms as a great victory. They streamed into the unions all over the country and built solid organizations in every plant. Now our job of mopping up began. We made the hundreds of small packers sign the Altshuler Award and then we read the organization campaign into many subsidiary sections of the industry, such as retail butcher shops, independent soap, washing powder, glue, canning, butterine, fertilizer, cooperage, etc., works. Besides this, many other local industries, such as machine shops, car works, etc., caught the contagion and were organized. In Chicago, we had dozens of strikes in this follow-up campaign. The most serious struggle was with the Union Stockyards and Transit Company. This powerful concern, owned by the great packers, receives, feeds and distributes the tens of thousands of animals arriving daily at the Chicago yards. It is the nerve center of the local packing industry. Its autocratic head, a Mr. Leonard, refused to sign the Altshuler Award, so he struck his 3,000 stock handlers on an hour's notice. Instantly, the transfer of all cattle, sheep and hogs stopped. Frantically, the packers wired all over the West to halt the shipment of stock. Johnston, Murphy and myself were summoned to the downtown Department of Justice office, where Claybaugh menaced us with jail for obstructing the war. But we stood our ground and insisted that the U.S.T. Company come to the union's terms. Gradually, the huge packing houses, cut off from supplies of animals, came to a standstill. The menace of a great packing house strike loomed. But, after a few days, the U.S.T. Company weakened and signed on the dotted line. It was a real victory and the oppressed packing house workers were jubilant. The Great Stockyards Organization campaign had by now achieved its major goal. The industry was thoroughly organized all over the country from top to bottom. More than 200,000 workers had come into the dozen federated unions. These included unskilled as well as skilled, immigrant workers and native-born, and fully 25,000 of the new members were Negroes. Many office employees also joined the organization, and even the stockyards policemen formed a union. At last, the autocratic packers were compelled to meet with the workers and talk business with them, and especially they did not relish conferring with Johnston and me. The packing house victory marked a new high stage in American labor organization. It was the first mass product trustified industry ever to be organized by the trade unions. And the victory was doubly significant in that it was accomplished by militant policies and on application of the industrial union principle, at least in a modified form. But, of course, the reactionary A.F. of L bureaucracy learned nothing constructive from all this. For as former I.T.U.E.L. militants, the campaign had a very special significance. It was a glowing justification of our boring from within policy, and it also showed what could be done on our theory of organizing the unorganized millions by militantly taking advantage of the war situation. The aftermath in the packing industry. It turned out that soon after Judge Altshuler's decision I left the packing industry to take up the big steel organizing campaign. But I cannot go on with that until after I tell how the splendid organization of the packing house workers was eventually destroyed by the packers, with effective assistance of the A.F. of L leaders. It is one of the most shameful stories of betrayals in American labor history. From the outset in 1917, the Gompersite officials of the Butcher Workmen, headed by Dennis Lane, a stockholder in a local packing company, did all possible to sabotage the organizing campaign. Their aim was to destroy the Stockyards Labor Council with its splendid solidarity and its militant leadership. They wanted to wipe out its industrial union trend and to re-establish the old, discredited craft system. So they fought to cut off its per capita tax from the locals. They demanded that each local have its own business agent, instead of our centralized system. They insisted that there be formed a second council, that is, a packing trades council of butcher workmen locals only. This was the fatal two-council system that had destroyed the 1904 strike and which, at the beginning of the Stockyards campaign, we had pledged ourselves never to reintroduce. They flooded the Chicago locals with organizers, who, supported by every packer's spy and stool pigeon, fought for this splitting program. It was in the face of such disruptive tactics that we had to go on with our organizing work. The fight became very bitter. Finally, Lane's crowd, in alliance with the notorious Simon O'Donnell gang of building trades thugs, decided to take over the Stockyards Labor Council by strong-arm methods. As an entering wedge, they tried to force us to seat one of their thugs as a delegate. We refused, and for this I was slated to be rubbed out, the notorious gunman, Big Tim Murphy, openly threatening me. However, we were not helpless, and we let it be known that, see my book, Misleaders of Labor, for further details. 102. From Byran to Stalin, if any rough stuff were tried, we would know whom to reach and how. The Lane-O'Donnell plan fell through and we remained in full control. In the first year after I left the packing industry, the fight grew still more bitter. 2 organizers were killed. My successor as secretary of the S.L.C., Jack Johnston, one time, gun in hand, shot it out successfully with a gang of Lane's armed raiders who tried to seize the headquarters by force. Lane, who controlled the official butcher workman union machinery outside of Chicago, our weak spot all along, finally organized a Chicago Packing Trades Council. Only about 2,000 members joined it. He thereupon expelled 40,000 of his union's members who remained affiliated to the Stockyards Labor Council. The Chicago Federation of Labor protested against this outrage but was warned by Gompers to keep its hands off. Then other A.F. of L union officials in the packing industry set to work to help Lane split up the packing house workers and destroy the industrial solidarity that had been the key to the great success of the movement. Finally, there were 3 councils: the Packing Trades Council, the Mechanical Trades Council, and the Stockyards Labor Council. Besides, there were several unattached locals and large numbers of unorganized workers, demoralized by the A.F. of L treachery. Similar disruptive tactics were used in other packing centers. This went on for 2.5 years after our big victory in 1918. By the fall of 1920, the former splendid organization was much weakened, so the packers, in step with the great post-war open shop offensive of the time against organized labor, set up company unions, slashed wages, and broke off all relations with the unions. The workers replied to these attacks by a national packing house strike on December 5, 1920. But though they fought heroically, they were defeated and their organization about completely wiped out, a victim of the reactionary policies of the A.F. of L. If the Greens and Hutchisons of today wish to know one of many reasons why the workers in the basic industries want A.F. of L. meat packing campaign 10 grams no more of craft unions and are demanding industrial organization, let them observe the tragedy of the packing house 1917 to 1921 movement. From meat packing to steel. But let us come back to the events of 1918. with my theory that the main revolutionary task was the organization of the millions into the trade unions and that at all costs the wartime demand for workers must be utilized to this end, I naturally sought to use the big victory in the packing industry as a point of departure for a new organization drive. I had no idea of settling down as a trade union official in the packing industry. After considerable thought, I decided to make a try at steel. The trade unions had conquered their first trustified industry, meatpacking, and I was confident that, if they would only bestir themselves a bit, they could also win out in the greatest of all trustified industries, steel. Therefore, even before Judge Altshuler had handed down his arbitration decision, I, being sure that he must grant most of our demands, had written a resolution to have the Chicago Federation of Labor call upon the A.F. of L to initiate a national organizing campaign in the steel industry along the general lines that had proved so successful in meatpacking. However, for a couple of weeks I did not introduce the resolution into the C.F. of L because of a curious reason. During our arbitration, the Packers' lawyer, Condon, had dramatically declared that if Altshuler conceded our demands it would create a vast upheaval among workers in industry generally and that millions of them would go marching in to the bosses to make similar demands. Even as he was saying this I had in my pocket the proposed steel campaign resolution. So fearing that its introduction into the C.F. of L might seem to Altshuler too much like Condon's prophecy coming true and thereby adversely affect his decision, I had to withhold it until after the judge's award. Finally, on April 7, 1918, a week after Altshuler's decision, 104 from Byran to Stalin, I introduced the resolution into the C.F. of L, signed by the railway carmen asterisk and a dozen other metal trade unions. It called for a nationwide A.F. of L joint campaign of all the unions having jurisdiction over workers in the steel industry. It was based on a broad industrial movement, from the coal and iron miners and the lake transport workers all through the industry to the men doing the last phases of finishing in the fabricating division of the steel industry and those who hauled the final products out onto the railroad main lines. Such a federated movement, as in the packing industry, was the most practical approach to be made to the necessary industrial form. The C.F. of L adopted the resolution unanimously and the Great Steel Campaign was on. The railway carmen came into this campaign on the basis that there were scores of thousands of steel car builders in the great steel plants in McKees Rocks, Butler, Pullman, Johnstown, and many other plants. I was a member of this craft union. Chapter X. The A.F. of L. The Steel Campaign. It is impossible within the confines of this chapter to sum up even the main events of the big steel organizing campaign and strike of 1918-20. I have done that in my book, The Great Steel Strike and Its Lessons, and in my two pamphlets, Unionizing Steel and Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry. Here I can only consider some aspects of the struggle not adequately dealt with in these publications. I especially wish to treat more fully of the reactionary attitude of the A.F. of L officialdom. This is now the more pertinent in view of the sabotaging activities of these bureaucrats, as I write this, in the Big C.I.O. drive of 1936, in steel. Lassoing the labor bureaucrats. The A.F. of L leaders, with their social peace, wartime policy, made no effort to organize the more than ripe basic industries. Indeed, they actually hampered such work. Sufficient proofs of this were the facts that I, a rank and file worker on the job, had to initiate the National Packing House campaign, and that we faced A.F. of L opposition from start to finish. The A.F. of L leaders were even less interested in organizing steel. Again, the vitally important work had to be started by myself, who was by this time a lesser official. And again, breaking through A.F. of L sabotage constituted the major problem in organizing the workers. The A.F. of L's reactionary attitude towards organizing meatpacking and steel was characteristic of its policy in all the industries. What growth the unions made in the wartime was mostly spontaneous, the work of rank and file militants. A.F. of L's sabotage of the steel campaign began immediately after the Chicago Resolution was adopted. Our resolution asked the A.F. of L to lead the work, but Gompers thought to liquidate the matter offhand by referring the C.F. of L resolution to the approaching convention of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, He might as well have sent it to the United States Steel Corporation as the officials of this company-controlled union. Naturally, the A. convention evaded the whole business. But I was not to be sidetracked so easily, and I reintroduced the resolution into the C.F. of L. Here it was once more adopted and I was sent to the A.F. of L convention in St. Paul, June 1918, as C.F. of L delegate, to get action upon it. What happened at the convention was a classic of A.F. of L Organization, methods. Gompers let the resolution be adopted without change or opposition, for such resolutions make good reading matter for the rank and file. Besides, there are better ways to get rid of unpleasant resolutions than by directly rejecting them. My resolution called for a meeting of steel industry delegates during the convention to start the campaign. So, after waiting a few days and no meeting being called, I became alarmed and, inquiring from Secretary Morrison, I was informed that it would be held in about 6 weeks. Time was the very essence of my organizing plan, and delay would be fatal. We simply had to take advantage of the war situation if it was to succeed, and the war might end very shortly. I, therefore, protested to Morrison that this postponement was disastrous and in violation of the resolution, which very specifically provided for holding the meeting during the convention. So here is what took place. A day or two later, suddenly and without notifying me, an announcement was mumbled just before the convention's noon adjournment that the steel meeting would be held during the lunch recess. Think of it, a conference to organize the nationwide steel industry of 500,000 workers squeezed into the lunch period, with the delegates hurrying out to eat before the afternoon session. Very clearly it was a deliberate attempt to kill the campaign. Despite my experience with A.F.L. bureaucrats, I was shocked and astounded. I could see the steel campaign going to smash at its very start. At the designated corner of the convention hall, a number of delegates, on their way out to eat, stopped off, in curiosity mostly, to see what was going to take place. No Gompers or Morrison was there, and no one was in charge. I hastily called the meeting to order, and organizer Tom Flynn got on a table and began a speech about the need of organization. I could see that lack of time made such a course fatal, so I interrupted Flynn and proposed that we do only the following, which was done. Take the names of all present and call a meeting for the next night, over which we should invite Gompers to preside. Then we adjourned our lunch recess steel organizing conference. Now came the problem of getting Gompers to come to our meeting. That afternoon I informed him of what had taken place. The arch-bureaucrat listened in a bored manner, but he became furious when I invited him to the proposed meeting and refused point blank. Evidently he had already had enough of this bothersome steel campaign which refused to be killed. Then I pulled the ace out of my sleeve. I showed him the list of officials, our knot of curiosity seekers, who had attended the steel meeting, and I told him it was they who were inviting him. Then his tone changed and he grumbled out that, maybe, he would attend. So Gompers was roped in for the meeting. Now it remained to lasso the other necessary union leaders. To accomplish this I asked Gompers if he would make the announcement to the convention of the proposed steel meeting. No. You do it, he fairly yelled at me. So, that afternoon, I ventured to state to the convention that upon the request of Mr. Gompers I was authorized to invite all concerned to the steel conference, at which Gompers would be present. I could see Gompers getting purple as I said this. We had a good crowd. Gompers' name attracting them. Thus had succeeded my little strategy of netting Gompers by using the names of my curiosity seekers, and, on the other hand, of drawing in many other officials by utilizing Gompers' name. By such a device did I have to literally trick the A.F.L. leaders into this vital organization campaign. After this maneuver I felt as though I had been swimming in a sewer, and future prospects for the work seemed most unpromising. The principal thing our steel meeting did was to call a formal conference, to take place 6 weeks later. This was a deadly loss of time. The best organizing period American labor had ever known was fast slipping away as the war neared its end. 4 months were criminally wasted, from the time I originally introduced my resolution on April 7th, until the first real conference was to be held in August. Such delay can only be termed deliberate sabotage. At the St. Paul meeting, however, after much struggle, I managed to have the proposed conference scheduled for Chicago. I did this in the hope that thereby John Fitzpatrick, who was not at St. Paul, could be drawn into the work as A.F.L. organizer in Chicago, and thus help protect the sprouting campaign from the hostile reactionary bureaucrats. The Chicago Conference. The Chicago Steel Conference was held in the New Morrison Hotel, August 1–2, 1918. Representatives of 15 international unions were present. When the meeting got down to business, the chairman, Gompers, turned to me and said, "Well, Brother Foster, you have called us together. Now what do you propose?" That was the great Gompers' approach to organizing the steel industry. He had brought no proposals whatever. So I proceeded to outline my plan, which can be summarized as follows. There should be a whirlwind campaign of organization initiated at once and simultaneously in all important steel centers. This to be carried on jointly by all unions claiming jurisdiction in the steel industry. There should be used such methods as huge mass meetings, noted speakers, brass bands, parades, full-page newspaper advertisements, etc., to set the masses in motion. As financial means, I propose that each union should assess itself 25 cents per member, and to begin building an organizing crew, that each union should delegate 3 or more organizers. To carry on the work, all the unions should be closely federated, with a national committee headed by an A.F. of L representative. The unions should establish a uniform small initiation fee. I calculated that with such a great drive, we could get the bulk of the steel workers under our leadership in about 6 weeks. That is, 3 weeks' time to assemble our money and organizers, and 3 weeks to carry through a great series of 3 mass meetings in each town. These meetings, I figured, would give us such a grip on the masses of workers that we could at once send our committee to the Steel Trust, with an implied threat of a national steel strike if the committee were not received, a threat that we could enforce. This plan for a great, swift, simultaneous organizing drive in all steel centers was realistic and practical. It conformed to the actual situation and to the potentialities of the unions. It offered the best possible way to arouse the steelworkers' enthusiasm and to outwit the inevitable counter-strategy of the employers. The workers were in a militant mood and would have surely responded in decisive masses. My time schedule of 6 weeks was also strictly feasible. It had only taken us about 9 weeks to get the great masses under our leadership in the packing industry and to successfully threaten a strike, and, in view of our riper experience, added prestige and greater resources, we could have done the job much quicker in the steel industry. This would have brought our movement to a head while the war was still on, and the government and the Steel Trust could not possibly have faced a wartime strike in this great munitions industry. Had my proposals been adopted, we would have won through easily and definitely established the unions in the steel industry. The plan of federating the unions was likewise practical. 110. It was at that time the logical next step towards industrial unionism and the building of a single steel workers' organization. This was so because at that period there was little positive sentiment for industrial unionism in the A.F. of L, and it would have been utterly impossible to get the many craft unions to surrender their jurisdiction claims to the little, half-dead, corruptly led amalgamated association. The SYSTEM of Industrial Federation was succeeding on the railroads, and we had just won a great victory with it in the packing industry. It was a case of either a joint movement by the crafts or no campaign at all. I, of course, intended to try to push the crafts into an eventual general steel amalgamation if our campaign succeeded. My financial plan was similarly feasible. All the larger unions were rich with the wartime flood of initiation fees and dues. My own union, the Railway Carmen, for example, had some $3 million in its treasury. Each of them could have paid the 25-cent assessment from its funds without the slightest difficulty. Inasmuch as there were some 2 million members in the 24 unions eventually affiliated to our steel campaign, this would have given us several $100,000. I estimated that $50,000 would have sufficed to put on our great planned drive for 6 weeks. The Chicago Conference, however, made ducks and drakes of this whole realistic plan. All that remained when the unenthusiastic bureaucrats got done with it was the principle of a federated campaign. The conference set up the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers, which eventually included the 24 unions of iron miners, coal miners, steam shovelmen, clay workers, quarry workers, seamen, steel workers, stationary engineers, firemen, laborers, machinists, railway carmen, blacksmiths, coopers, electricians, boilermakers, pattern makers, bricklayers, structural iron workers, foundry workers, molders, sheet metal workers, steam fitters and switchmen. The movement thus covered the whole industry from the workers who produced the raw materials to those who delivered the A.F. of L. The Steel Campaign 111 finished products to the railroads, but none of the unions had more than a handful of members in the great unorganized steel industry. Gompers assumed the chairmanship of the National Committee and I was elected secretary. This was, like the secretaryship of the Stockyards Labor Council, for me an unpaid job, as I drew my wages from the B.R.C. of A. as a regular organizer. My proposal for an immediate, huge national drive in all steel towns simultaneously was killed. The top A.F. of L bureaucrats listened fishy-eyed and with ill-restrained disdain as I outlined the sure victory that must come from such a national drive. Several of them took the floor and, treating my plans as purely visionary, absurdly proposed instead concentrating the work in one locality, even in one steel mill, to show the workers what we can do and thereby win their confidence. Gompers listened impatiently when I proposed the 25-cent assessment. He did not even discuss it, nor did any of the others. It was simply ignored. Thus the vital assessment proposal went by the boards, and instead of the at least $50,000 indispensable, the 15 unions present voted the National Committee the ridiculous sum of $100 each. And in place of the crew of 100 or more organizers that I held to be immediately necessary, a mere half-dozen were delegated to the work. As for the A.F. of L, it neither gave nor pledged a dollar. On the second day of the conference, after my proposals had been well knocked on the head, Gompers withdrew from the meeting to join his convivial building trades cronies in a nearby hotel. To preside in his absence he named John Fitzpatrick as the ranking Chicago A. F. of L organizer. This, at least, was good. My strategy of getting Fitzpatrick into the campaign was succeeding. I was deeply dismayed by the results of the Chicago Conference, its defeat of my practical plan to organize the steel industry. It was pretty clear that the A. F. of L leaders were not interested in organizing the steel workers. One would think, from the resources given our national committee, that we were setting out to organize a bunch of peanut stands. Instead of 500,000 almost totally unorganized workers in the steel industry, American finance capital's chief open shop stronghold. It was such reactionary policies as these that cost the A. F. of L the loss of 5 million to 10 million possible members during the wartime. The final defeat of the steel workers 16 months later was directly traceable to the rejection of my plan by the Gompers leadership at the Chicago Conference. The organizing campaign. I dare say that when the Chicago Conference adjourned, few of the labor bureaucrats attending it thought that much more would be heard from the annoying steel campaign. But we went ahead anyhow. However, instead of a great, sweeping campaign, opened by National Steelworkers Week, with huge meetings, parades, etc., in 50 to 75 steel towns simultaneously all over the country, we had to confine our activities to the Chicago, Calumet, district. We at once began work in Gary, South Chicago, Joliet and Indiana Harbor. As far as we could, we applied the methods that we had intended using nationally. But, of course, these local activities were only a pale imitation of what our planned great national drive would have been. Nevertheless, we scored an immediate and tremendous success. In Gary, at our first meeting, 15,000 steelworkers attended, and similar mass turnouts were had in the other 3 steel towns the same week. Steel workers poured into our unions, by thousands. At the end of a month's time we could, if necessary, easily have struck all these great Chicago district steel trust mills. This was a brilliant demonstration of the correctness of my original plan. Without the least difficulty, had the trade union leaders so willed it, we could have accomplished simultaneously in every important steel town throughout the United States what we had done in the Chicago district. And the experience showed that we could have got the masses behind us in even less time than I had figured on. Had the Gompers leadership backed my plan with the necessary men and money, and they had plenty of both, our success in the Chicago district showed that well within the 6 weeks' time I had set we could have been knocking at Judge Gary's door and threatening him with a national strike. With the war still on, such a strike movement could only have resulted in a victory for the steel workers. Rejection of my original plan was tantamount to a refusal to organize the steel industry. But what a different prospect faced us now as we began to get underway. Our big successes in Chicago, although they failed utterly to arouse the enthusiasm of the A. F. of L-led Earship, greatly alarmed the steel trust heads, who previously had not taken us any more seriously than had Gompers. So they set out to fight us relentlessly. In the next months, lacking men and organizers, we laboriously spread our movement to other districts. We met the most skilled and ferocious resistance of the steel employers. To head us off, they gave 4 successive national wage increases and finally the basic 8-hour day. A month after our Chicago success, the war came to an end, and an industrial slump set in. The Seoul situation weakened our offensive, robbed us of the advantage of surprise, and the employers' counter-offensive against us correspondingly was greatly intensified. As we now slowly battered our way into one steel fortress after another, we faced wholesale suppression of the right of assembly in the steel towns. Our organizers were slugged and arrested, and one, Fanny Sellins, murdered. Many company unions were organized to block us, 30,000 workers were discharged for union membership, Ku Klux Klan movements were fostered, elaborate spy systems were used against us, etc. In short, we faced the whole battery of weapons of the Great Steel Trust. All these overwhelming difficulties would have been avoided, of course, by carrying through my original plan. Our work was now many times more difficult. But, of our multiplying difficulties, the most serious was the steady sabotage we suffered from within our own ranks, from the affiliated union leaders. They systematically and shamelessly betrayed the steel workers into the hands of the Steel Trust. The tremendous importance to the working class of organizing the steel industry, though it stirred the violent resistance of the capitalists, left the A. F. of L leadership quite cold. One of the gravest forms of this official A. F. of L sabotage was the practice of the top leaders, with few exceptions, to stay away from the meetings of our national committee and to delegate in their stead powerless local business agents. Thus they escaped giving support to the campaign, while at the same time making an appearance of going along with it. The consequence was that we were constantly strangled for want of resources and unity of action. Gompers himself was the worst offender in this respect. He was actual chairman of our national committee, but he never spoke at a single meeting of steel workers in the whole campaign, nor helped us raise $1 in money or build a crew of organizers. And about the only way I could get him to come to our meetings was to call an occasional meeting under his very nose, in the room of the A. F. of L. Executive Council in Washington, and sometimes even then he evaded it. Gompers always pleaded lack of time. He found plenty of time, however, to spend several months in Europe helping rig up the infamous Versailles Treaty. He also found time to junket down to Mexico City to set up that tool of American imperialism, the Pan-American Federation of Labor, but he had no time for the steel workers, struggling so desperately to establish trade unions. I remember that once, during a special crisis for want of funds, organizers and more concerted action by the unions, I drafted a very strong letter urging all the affiliated union heads to attend our next National Committee meeting. Then, J.G. Brown, our general organizer, went to Washington to get Gompers to sign it jointly with me. Very reluctantly he did so. But here is what happened. Upon receipt of the letter signed by Gompers and myself, various steel union leaders called up Sam and inquired how about this letter, was it really so urgent, etc. Whereupon Gompers told them that it was all right, only a routine meeting. Result: the same old kind of meeting with nearly all the decisive leaders absent. Even Gompers himself did not come. With such a lead from Gompers, the various union heads felt quite safe in the neglect and betrayal that they perpetrated constantly against the steel campaign. Gompers hung on to the chairmanship of our National Committee, usually commissioning John Fitzpatrick to serve in his place. Finally, however, on the eve of our big strike, he quit in order to free himself of responsibility, and Defy Knightley appointed Fitzpatrick as chairman. The sabotage of the steel campaign by the top officials of the 24 affiliated unions is clearly revealed, beyond possibility of contradiction, by the financial figures of the movement in my final report. The total funds eventually contributed to our National Committee by its 24 unions were only $101,047. This starvation amount, which we painfully extracted from them over a period of many months, was supposed to finance a great nationwide organization campaign of 14 months' duration, and to feed and otherwise finance a 3.5-month strike of 365,000 steel workers. Actually, all things considered, as I showed, the steel workers financed their own movement with the funds they paid in as initiation fees and dues. And even this sum of $101,047, together with what the 24 unions themselves spent for their average of 3 organizers apiece, was more than offset by the huge sums, not less than $500,000, that we turned over to them, and that was collected by themselves in initiations and dues from the steel workers. The unions were flush with money at the time and, had they been sufficiently interested, almost any one of them could, alone, have given more to our strike movement than all of them did together. The fact is that the 3 radical needle trades unions, Amalgamated Clothing Workers, Ladies' Garment Workers and Furriers, outside the steel industry altogether, donated a total of $180,000 to our strike relief fund. 116. From Byran to Stalin are almost double what the whole 24 affiliated steel industry unions gave during the entire 16-month struggle. The financial sabotage scandal reached its peak in the case of the ultra-reactionary of iron, steel and tin workers. This, the basic union in the industry, actually made a large surplus out of the campaign. From this union our National Committee, for all purposes, including strike relief, received only $11,811.81, although we had turned over to them more than $150,000 in initiation fees, and they had collected probably twice as much more directly from the steel workers in initiation fees and dues. This union treasury showed a surplus of $206,000. With this huge surplus the reactionary Tige leaders bought, after the strike, a national union headquarters building in Pittsburgh. As for the AFL itself, it raised no money whatever for the organizing campaign. When the strike came, we practically forced it to issue a general call for funds. This raised $418,141.14, but it was collected mostly by our steel organizers, the AFL officers making no effort. These were the only monies WTE received from the AFL, and they came 14 months after the campaign had begun and 6 weeks after we had 365,000 strikers in the streets. However, despite all obstacles, the spy system, wholesale discharges of workers, wage concessions, company unionism, terrorism, suppression of civil rights, etc., of the Steel Trust and the deadly sabotage of the top union leaders, we finally managed, in the course of 14 months of bitter struggle, to firmly establish the unions in the many key plants of the Steel Trust in the main steel districts. My final financial report showed a minimum of 250,000 workers organized. There were probably many more than that. Our loyal staff of organizers could with justice make the proud boast that we had done the impossible, organized the great mass of the workers in the steel industry. Where the AFL had failed utterly for 25 years, we had succeeded. Labor had scaled the ramparts of the greatest of all open shop fortresses. AFL, the Steel Campaign 117. The 1919 Steel Strike. Then came the Great Steel Strike, beginning September 22, 1919. Our committee had approached Judge Gary, head of the U.S. Steel Corporation, with our demands, but he refused to meet with us. Meanwhile, all through the industry a big offensive was on to smash our unions. Over 30,000 of our members were already on the streets, discharged because of union activity. It was a case of either fight or die. We chose to fight. In response to our strike call, 365,000 steelworkers struck in 50 cities of 10 states. Almost every key plant of the U.S. Steel and Big Independence was paralyzed. The steel workers dealt a smashing blow at their giant enemy. The steel industry has never seen, before or since, a strike remotely approaching such magnitude and powerful effect. Needless for me to recapitulate, the strike was fought day paradely by the steel corporations. The brave strikers had to face a reign of terror set up by armies of scabs, private gunmen, deputy sheriffs, police and soldiers. Civil rights were completely suppressed in many of the key steel districts. A ferocious campaign of publicity was carried on against the strike all over the country. But worst of all was the sabotage within our own ranks. The persistent treachery of the top leadership now often reached the stage of strike-breaking. Exemplified by the attempts of the A. to betray the whole movement for a separate agreement, the attempt of the Santatenary engineers to keep their craft at work, and, most disastrous of all, the refusal of the railroad brotherhoods to call out their men, who were organized but without union agreements, working on the highly strategic short roads connecting the steel mills with the mainline railroads, the failure of the A.F.L. National Office to rally the labor movement behind the steel strikers, etc. The heroism of the steel workers could not avail against all this hostile force. 22 were killed, hundreds were, the Department of Labor figures said 367,000. Slugged and shot, several thousands were arrested, and over 1.5 million men, women and children starved and struggled. But the Great Strike, although it eventually abolished the 12-hour day and caused many other improvements, did not win its major objective of unionization. On January 8, 1920, we called it off unconditionally. About 100,000 were still out, but the strike had lost its effectiveness. The bitter 3.5-month strike was defeated and the steelworkers' new unions, built with such infinite difficulty, were smashed. Could defeat have been avoided? In the New York World of April 4, 1922, Gompers charges me with responsibility for the loss of the 1919 steel strike as follows. This is the same Foster, who in the face of definite information that the U.S. Steel Corporation was prepared for and wished to strike in 1919 and in the face of a request of the President of the United States that the strike be at least postponed, insisted on that disastrous struggle. It took a lot of crust for one who sabotaged the steel campaign like Gompers did, to accuse me of wrecking the movement. But aside from that, at the outset let me say that I am proud to accept my full share of responsibility for the steel strike, even though it WTA's lost. Never was a strike more necessary, more justified historically. To have accepted the proposed strike, postponement, that Gompers speaks of would have amounted to the rankest betrayal of the steel workers. His postponement was of a piece with his sabotage policy from the beginning of our campaign. The situation was as follows. On September 1 ith, just 11 days before our scheduled strike date, President Wilson gave a story to the press demanding a postponement of the strike until after the holding of his National Industrial Conference, which was to begin on October 6, and which was supposed to establish industrial peace between capital and labor in the United States. PERS, without consulting us, at once issued a public statement endorsing Wilson's demand to postpone the strike. Then, proving that there was a concerted movement among the top A.F.L. leaders, there poured into our office a stream of wires supporting Wilson's and Gompers' stand from a majority of the union presidents who made up our national committee. A few will suffice to show their trend. I wish to be recorded as in favor of complying with the President's request. W. H. Johnston, Pres. International. ASSO, of Machinists. Engineers will abide by suggestions of President Wilson that we delay action until after Labor Conference at Washington. M. Snellings, Pres. Steam and Operating Engineers. The Executive Board of the Bricklayers, Masons and Plasterers. International Union desires action in steel strike postponed till after Industrial Conference in Washington. W. M. Bowen, Pres. It is our opinion that there should be no strike called until after the October Conference. J. R. Alpine, Pres. Plumbers and Steamfitters. A strike at this time would be very inopportune. M. F. Ryan, Pres. Bro. Railway Carmen. It will be better to postpone the calling of the strike until after President Wilson's conference of October 6. W. M. Atkinson, Acting Pres. Boilermakers. We oppose a strike in the steel industry until after the adjournment of the industrial meeting called by President Wilson. J. Wilson, Pres. Pattern makers. Various other Union presidents wired similarly, while the ultra-reactionary officials of the A. dodged about on the question, fearing openly to advocate postponement. The only presidents who definitely opposed halting the strike were those of the blacksmiths and mine, mill and smeltermen. All this created a real crisis for us. The Steel Trust was violently attacking our unions, and here WTE were confronted with a demand from the heads of the government and of the A.F. of L, backed by a majority of our committee, that our strike be called off. And worse yet, this demand was framed in such an insidious way as to make it appear that there was requested only a short postponement until Labor's friend, President Wilson, could satisfactorily adjust the whole matter. As for myself, I was immediately convinced that any postponement of the strike would be fatal. I had not the slightest confidence in President Wilson or his three-cornered conference of capital, labor and the public doing anything for the steel workers. A postponement of the strike would inevitably destroy the workers' confidence in our movement, throw the unions at the mercy of the vicious Steel Trust, and smash the whole organization in a welter of confusion and wildcat strikes. Far better to take a fighting chance with our 250,000 and more organized steel workers. In any event, the best way to get consideration from the Industrial Conference was to confront it with a great strike. But what could I do to hold fast to our strike date? To simply call together our national committee would have been suicidal, as the majority were against the strike. Shortness of time also forbade any kind of a formal rank-and-file vote or national conference. So, upon my own responsibility, I wired and telephoned our field organizers, at least 95% of whom were honest and wanted earnestly to have the steel workers organized, to express the opinions of their local steel councils. Immediately, I received a flood of telegrams, showing an overwhelming mass demand to go on with the strike. Thus a few of them: "Unless you call the strike before Friday morning, we will be forced to take matters into our own hands." Gary and South Chicago Steel Councils in joint session. General Committee of all unions at Bethlehem unanimously voted to demand strike action by your committee. Dave Williams, organizer: "We cannot be expected to meet the enraged workers who will consider us traitors if strike is postponed." Organizers of Youngstown District: "It is imperative that the strike be not postponed, as the result will be a demoralization of our forces and the creating of a situation that will be positively dangerous." District Organizing Secretaries of Youngstown, Rankin, Braddock, Homestead, Butler, Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Wheeling, Steubenville, Buffalo. Fitzpatrick, although he had little faith generally in strikes, agreed with the field organizers in my opinion that to postpone the strike would be fatal. So we drafted a telegram to Gompers, which the third member of our committee, the A. reactionary, Tig, was afraid not to sign, that postponement would mean absolute demoralization and utter ruin for our movement, and demanded that the strike go on as scheduled. Thus, we confronted a head-on collision between the militant masses of steel workers and the reactionary top union leadership backed by the President of the United States. It all ended by Gompers and company backing up. They simply did not dare to assume the responsibility of openly destroying our movement and denying the steel workers their only chance to win. So the Great Strike went into effect, as scheduled, on September 22, but, needless to say, its chances for success had been gravely injured by the Wilson-Gompers postponement maneuver, which alienated public sympathy. The outcome of Wilson's National Industrial Conference showed that we were quite right in not surrendering the steelworkers' fate into its hands. At this time, the large employers were just launching into the biggest open shop drive in American labor history, the ferocious post-war offensive against the workers to strip them of the better wages, shorter hours and union organizations they had built up during the war. Wilson's conference, dominated by the greatest capitalist interests, reflected this developing offensive, and it was so reactionary that it immediately split over labor's proposal to grant the workers the elementary right of organization. Even the reactionary Gompers leaders had to walk out of the conference. 14 years later, the steel workers had again built up a big movement and had developed, in the growing wave of strike struggle and trade unionism in the N.R.A. days of 1934, the best opportunity for a successful steel strike that ever existed in the steel industry. But they unwisely listened to the appeal of President Roosevelt, like Wilson, a friend of labor, and William Greene, that their promising strike movement be postponed, and the workers' cause be committed to the tender care of a government board. Result: complete defeat for the workers and the liquidation and thorough discrediting of their union, the A. And so it would have been with us in 1919, but on a much worse scale. In going ahead with our strike, we protected the workers' fighting chance, and we would have won the strike had it not been for the strike-breaking tactics of the A.F. of L leaders. To have adopted the Wilson-Gompers postponement would have meant certain disaster, and the greatest strike-breaking shame the American labor movement has ever known. If A.F. of L leaders seek responsibility for the loss of the steel strike, they need look no further than their own general offices. The true cause of the defeat was to be found in their reactionary attitude of indifference, sabotage and strike-breaking towards the steel campaign from the beginning to the end. Had they adopted my original plan at the Chicago conference, we could have won hands down, at most with a short wartime strike. But their policies of denying the movement the necessary organizers and money crippled the whole campaign and forced it into a period when the war was over, the acute demand for munitions had ended, an industrial slump was at hand, the government had abandoned its conciliatory attitude, and a great employer's offensive was underway. Nor could all the militancy and sacrifices of the steel workers in their bitterly fought organization drive and heroic strike overcome these obstacles, raised primarily through the sabotaging policy of the reactionary A.F. of L. leaders. The strategy behind the steel strike. Naturally, victory in the steel campaign would have given a tremendous impetus to the organization of the workers in all industries. With my super appreciation of the importance of trade unionism, I was quite aware of the possibilities such a victory would open up, and I based my general strategy upon them. When we won through in the packing industry, I had been quick to take advantage of the stimulus it gave and to extend the campaign into steel. And if the steel campaign had been successful, I was prepared to repeat this procedure and to branch out into a still more ambitious program. The capture of the main open shop fortress, steel, by the trade unions would have made easy the organization of many other industries. And my aim was to take advantage of such a situation by having the A.F. of L launch a gigantic campaign of unionization simultaneously in all major unorganized industries. Concretely, I planned to propose that there be set up a big national committee, patterned after our steel committee, which should supervise the work of organization through subcommittees in each and every industry. I calculated that if we managed to defeat the Steel Trust, we consequently would be able to line up the A.F. of L for such a great organizing campaign and carry it through successfully in spite of all official sabotage. We would then be able to organize literally millions of workers and to make real progress towards actually unionizing the working class as a whole. It was a bold plan but a feasible one, had the A.F. of L leaders permitted the steel campaign to be won. Such a great influx of members would, as I was quite consciously aware, profoundly change the character of the trade unions. Among the certain basic changes would be A. To shift the center of gravity from the skilled workers to the less skilled. B. To break down the old system of craft unionism and lay the basis of industrial organization. C. To give the unions more of a class struggle policy and to broaden their social outlook. D. To develop a more honest and progressive leadership. In short, I figured that such a great movement would go far towards realizing the boring from within plan which we had nourished for years, the revolutionization of the A.F. of L. The above revolutionizing tendencies were already clearly in evidence in the packing and steel campaigns. Both movements were based primarily upon the unskilled masses, both were distinctly industrial unionist, both had a fighting policy, and both had developed a new anti-Gompers leadership. In these campaigns I had been especially active in pushing forward John Fitzpatrick, whom I sized up as an honest and courageous fighter. I lost no occasion to enhance his prestige and to strengthen his position. I was directly instrumental in his becoming chairman of our steel committee, and I speculated upon his being chairman of the great organizing campaign I had in mind. And I could see his whole advance as one day culminating in his assuming Gompers' place, F. But I could not unfold all these plans and speculations to the rather slow-going Fitzpatrick. He had to advance from one stage to another. Thus, at first he was skeptical when I had initiated the packing house campaign, and he simply said I was crazy when I later proposed organizing steel. But as the campaigns got underway, he caught their spirit and gave them his wholehearted support. I figured he would do the same in the higher stages to come in our movement. It did not require any great brilliance to figure out the above major results of a victory in steel. That is, the organization of millions of other workers and the transformation of the A.F. of L, and it is certain that the shrewd advisors of Gary and his powerful banker associates had more than in those days. Fitzpatrick was quite appreciative of this boosting process. Once he wrote me as follows: after a local success in steel, I received your letter and was very glad to know of your success. Of course, it could not be otherwise with you at the helm. However, it has caused great interest and you cannot begin to understand the great amount of credit I am receiving as a result of your efforts. So keep on and soon I will have a halo of glory and you will be in jail. The material in this section is dealt with more fully in my open letter to John Fitzpatrick, Labor Herald, June 1924. Inkling of them. They doubtless realized that if we won the steel strike they would confront a rejuvenated and far more powerful labor movement, for which industry could resist unionization if steel were vanquished. That is why they fought the strike with such relentless fury. Gompers, a keen old fox, also knew what the unfavorable implications to him of a victory in steel would be, and that is why he, too, sabotaged our struggle. He could plainly see all the industrial union tendencies developing in the packing and steel campaigns, and he could not help but feel them as a growing menace to his whole regime. As for the question of a new anti-Gompers leadership, that matter actually broke out into the open and became a living issue. It happened this way. One day George P. West was in our Pittsburgh office. We had been quite friendly, and inadvertently, I hinted at the real meaning of the steel campaign to the A.F. of L. West, giving me no inkling of his plan, sprang a scoop in the Nation of April 9, 1919. Dramatically, he pictured the menace the rising Fitzpatrick-Foster combination held for the declining Gompers-Morrison crowd and the revolutionizing of the A.F. of L. Gompers was furious and demanded an explanation from Fitzpatrick. The latter called me up from Chicago. We were in the midst of the organization campaign, and an open fight would surely destroy it. So Fitzpatrick and I agreed to pooh-pooh West's story and let it go at that. But I was astonished and dismayed a few days later when I received a letter from Fitzpatrick containing a copy of his reply to Gompers, fantastically giving the latter vast praise for his work in both the packing and steel campaigns. It was a bad retreat, and it foreshadowed the ultimate surrender of Fitzpatrick to Gompers 4 years later in the midst of the bitter struggle of that time. But Gompers and the other A.F. of L leaders were not reassured by the weak, apologetic letter of John Fitzpatrick. They only felt safe when the strike, with its radical lead, during the steel campaign. Fitzpatrick was located in Chicago, as president of the C.F. of L, while one headed the national organizing forces in Pittsburgh. Worship and, to them, threatening possibilities, was beaten. If these leaders, with few exceptions, sabotaged the campaign from start to finish, it was because they, like Gary, had a vested interest that was in danger. All of which goes to show that the organization of steel and other basic industries is the task of the progressive wing of the labor movement and must be done in the face of reactionary labor leader opposition. This is as true in the 1936 steel drive of the progressive C.I.O. unions as it was of the 1919 steel campaign. The organization of the steel industry was the most advanced point ever reached by the American trade union movement. The unions had deeply penetrated the greatest open shop industry. More was at stake in 1919 steel strike than in any other in American history. The victory of this struggle, which the union leadership could have brought about, would have raised the whole trade union movement to a much higher level of strength and development. Its defeat, by the same token, was a big factor in intensifying the oncoming heavy employers' offensive and in deepening the reactionary trend in the unions during the following several years. Regarding some criticisms, my activities in the packing house and steel campaigns have not been free of sharp criticism. That which came from employer sources and official A.F. of L quarters merits no answer, and I make none. But some left elements have also vociferously criticized me, on the grounds that during this period I had abandoned my revolutionary outlook and become part and parcel of the Gompers machine. These critics were aided by Gompers himself, who, in his need to shed all responsibility for my securing such a strategic position in the trade unions, says in his 70 years of life and labor that I had basely deceived him, the poor innocent, regarding my views. But these statements, a tissue of falsifications and an example of how unscrupulously Gompers fought his adversaries, are on a par with his slanderous remarks about Debs on page 416, volume 1, of the same book. By the great mass demand for Debs' release from jail after the war, Gompers had been literally whipped into bestirring himself. Also, severely condemned my attitude towards the war. This criticism was based upon chiefly my testimony before the U.S. Senate committee that investigated the steel strike. The Senate committee incident developed thus. On the day after the steel strike began, the Senate appointed a committee to investigate the controversy. The strike situation was extremely tense. The country was in the midst of the deep post-war period of political reaction, with its waves of undiminished war hysteria, Palmer, Red Raids, American Legion and Ku Klux Klan violence and capitalist fear of impending mass working-class upheaval. The launching of the national steel strike intensified all this fear and hysteria. With thousand-tongued fury, the press shrieked that this was not a real strike but a revolutionary outbreak, a red attempt to overthrow the government and to set up Bolshevik Soviets in America. In the midst of this acute excitement, I was summoned to Washington to testify before the reactionary Senate Committee. In view of my I.W. and S.L. of N.A. past, I had been highly dramatized as the chief Red who was using the steel strike to begin the revolution. It was quite clear that the Senate Committee's aim was to get a revolutionary speech from me with which to whip up the existing terror and thereby enable the forces of reaction to literally tear the steel strike to shreds. What, then, should I do? As I have already made clear, I attached the most profound importance to the winning of the steel strike. I saw in its victory not only the well-being of over 1,500,000 men, women and children, but what was even more important, that it would open the door to the Ingham Debs. As I did when we were friends, I went to see him in Atlanta. As we talked together, the perverting twist that had possessed his mind and character since the days of Woodstock jail seemed to disappear. I saw him again when he came to Washington after his release from Atlanta. He was gentle and genial and seemed greatly touched at what I had done for him. He allowed the message to be brought to me that he had completely changed his point of view. However, it was only a short time before he avowed anew his pre-war and during the war attitude. To have done otherwise would have been to invite oblivion. Trade union organization of millions of workers in other industries, that it would bring about a complete reorganization of the A.F. of L in structure, policies and leadership, and would place a powerful revolutionary weapon in the hands of the working class. I was, therefore, ready to do anything, to sacrifice everything, in order to win the strike. And I was quite convinced also that in the existing circumstances of anti-red hysteria a frank statement of my views on the Senate Committee's witness stand would furnish the Capital East enemy with just the weapon it wanted to destroy the strike. I knew also that the Gompers bureaucracy would seize upon such an occasion to throw the strike to the wolves. I feared, in addition, that such a speech, garbled and twisted by the hysterical press, would confuse and demoralize the steelworkers themselves, who were far from being revolutionary and who had not been prepared for such a development. Especially great was the latter danger, because there was no strong revolutionary party backing the strike, the Communist Party then just being bomb and the Socialist Party being quite unreliable. So I resolved beforehand not to make a frank exposition of my viewpoint, but, at all costs, to shield the strike. I deemed it incomparably more important to protect the steelworkers from added attack than to voice my revolutionary convictions. Come what might, I was determined not to allow the government to use me to break the strike. On the witness stand I tried to confine the question at issue to the economic demands of the workers and to discard my personal opinions as beside the point. But this proved impossible, as it put me in the untenable position of evasion. Then I offered to develop fully my viewpoint if the press were excluded from the hearing. This also the hostile committee rejected, and I was confronted with the necessity to speak. Thereupon, feeling myself under compulsion and in a sort of police trap, I delivered the testimony for which I have been so sharply criticized. In brief, I obscured my conception of the revolutionary role of the trade unions, did not draw a sharp political line between the A.F. of L leadership and myself, and stated that I had endorsed the war. This testimony, extracted from me under these circumstances, did not express my true convictions. It failed to correspond to my past attitudes, to my work during the wartime, or to my later activities. Let me be specific. First, as to the charge made against me that I had given up my revolutionary opinions, to the Senate Committee I could indeed say that I had greatly altered my views since I wrote the S.L. of N.A. pamphlet Syndicalism, which played such a big role in the whole situation, but this only meant that I had changed my revolutionary perspective, not abandoned it. As I have outlined in the earlier chapter on the International Trade Union Educational League, I had developed the theory, a type of syndicalism, that the trade unions, by their constant process of increasing their forces and demands, were making straight for the overthrow of capitalism, in spite of their conservative outlook. I, therefore, felt sure that I was doing genuinely revolutionary work by letting in the wartime mobilization of 565,000 workers in the packing and steel industries and throwing the way open for the organization of millions more. All syndicalist theory, mine as well as others, is opportunistic and non-revolutionary, but this by no means implies that in developing my particular brand of syndicalism I had consciously abandoned my revolutionary goal. On the contrary, I was profoundly convinced that by my wartime organization work I was proceeding by the fastest and shortest route, by the only route, in fact, to the revolution. Now as to the accusation that I had become part of the Gompers machine. This is sheer nonsense, as should be clear from what I have said earlier. Although it is a fact that during the packing house and steel campaigns I directed little open criticism against the Gompers leaders, which was a serious error, it is absolutely unjustified to assume therefrom that I had surrendered to these reactionaries. On the contrary, my whole work was aimed at smashing the Gompers regime, lock, stock and barrel. I carried on my organization work in the conscious realization, first, that it could only succeed by defeating the A.F. of L top leaders, and, second, that the success of the campaigns I had in mind after a victory in steel would completely wreck the Gompers machine and change the whole A.F. of L structure, leadership and viewpoint. Hence part of my general program was to develop a new leadership, and the whole trend of our movement was to build a powerful left progressive bloc in the A.F. of L. The method I used in fighting the Gompersites was the flank attack. That is, instead of a frontal denunciation which in the existing circumstances, as I was without strong organized backing, would have created an open rupture and made my organization work impossible, I strove to confront the A.F. of L leaders with giant organization campaigns they could not defeat. Thus eventually would be mobilized against them huge masses of unskilled and semi-skilled workers, led by radical and progressive leaders, who would put an end to the whole Gompers regime. This plan was in line with my struggle against the corrupt A.F. of L leadership. Finally, as to my attitude towards the war. In this matter, I deserved sharpest criticism, because, undeniably my position was highly opportunistic. As I have stated, however, my testimony before the Senate Committee did not express my real sentiments. The error of my wartime position originated in my false syndicalistic conception that the decisive revolutionary task was the building of the trade unions and that to this end all other activities should be subordinated or eliminated, including even direct agitation against the war. A correct policy would have put the fight against the war first and everything else subsidiary to this central task. I was right in opposing the World War and America's entry into it. But once the latter had taken place, I wrongly focused my attention entirely upon one thing, the organization of the unorganized. As I have shown, I made it my central policy to take advantage of the huge demand for workers by pushing organization campaigns and militant strikes, with the conception that thus I was creating in the swiftest possible manner the means that would end capitalism, the mass trade unions. This opportunistic policy did not lead me to actually take part in the pro-war activities, the stories current about my selling war bonds being without foundation. But I unquestionably did not make opposition to such activities, with which the trade unions all about me were much occupied. I worked only on my main task of organizing the unions. And my policy for such aggressive organization campaigns and strikes in the basic, trustified and munitions industries was in sharp contradiction to the social peace, no strike, policies of the A.F. of L and the government. Steel marches again. As I write this, July 1936, a new campaign to organize the steel workers is beginning. This time under the leadership of the Committee for Industrial Organization, headed by John L. Lewis, President of the U.M.W.A. But now the work is starting under more favorable circumstances than in 1919. 1. The economic situation in the industry is on the upgrade, whereas, in 1919, the steel industry was slipping into a slump. 2. The political situation is also better, whereas the 1919 campaign was carried on in an atmosphere of red raids and deepening reaction. The present campaign is going ahead in an election year, with both parties scrambling for the workers' votes, and the government is mildly favorable to the campaign. 3. The workers now, feeling the upsurge generally among the masses, are in an aggressive mood, but in 191 grams they were on the defensive in the face of a huge nationwide attack by the employers. 4. The present campaign has the solid backing of 1,250,000 workers, besides wide support in the labor movement generally, while we had very little of such support. 5. In 1919 we began our campaign with only $1,400, but the C.I. Ali discredited, whereas in 1919 they were brand new and surrounded by many illusions. 8. The big language problem of non-English speaking workers, which was acute in 1919, is greatly diminished now. 9. The 1936 organizers have before them for their guidance a whole series of vital lessons learned in the 1919 struggle. 10. These organizers are also working with the confidence bred of the fact the steel industry actually was organized in 1919, whereas our organizers had to face a monumental pessimism and general disbelief in the possibility of unionizing the steel industry. 11. The radio now also enables the steel workers to escape much of the 1919 terrorism by receiving the union message in their homes. 12. And lastly, there is now in the field to help a strong communist party, a vital force which we altogether lacked in 1919. All these advantages of the 1936 campaign over that of 1919 would indicate that the steel workers should be readily organized, notwithstanding the Steel Trust's opposition and in spite of A.F. of L sabotaging, which we also suffered in disastrous degree in 1919. The decisive problem will be to win the strike, which will almost certainly come before the Steel Trust will agree to deal with the unions. And this strike, which probably will be the greatest and most important in American labor history, can be won. But it will require a powerful mobilization of labor's forces. Many industries may be involved. Especially vital will be solid support from the miners and railroad workers in the steel areas. The winning of the steel drive will open up tremendous possibilities for the labor movement, even as its defeat would be a great disaster. Victory will make it possible to organize millions of workers readily. We saw this clearly in 1919 and planned accordingly. But the perspective is even greater now than in 1919. Millions of new workers in the trade unions, the reorganization and rejuvenation of the A.F. of L, the formation of a national farmer labor party. These are some of the major implications of a successful drive to organize the steel workers.